They say the cage pack is built on a foundation of honor, but I've spent the last decade learning that honor is just a word men use to justify the blood on their hands. I'm back in the palace now, hiding behind a mask of scars, and a silence so deep it feels like a physical weight. I'm just Rhea, the invisible servant who scrubs the floors, while the Alpha King prepares for a wedding that will seal this pack's fate. No one looks at me, no one suspects me. But as the first embers of a new conspiracy begin to glow, I realize that some secrets aren't just buried. They're breathing. And tonight, the shadows are starting to scream. Chapter 1: The Scent of Ashes. The smell of expensive pine-scented floor wax is, quite frankly, offensive. It's trying too hard to cover up the fact that this palace is built on bones and bad decisions. I scrub the marble floor of the East Wing with a vigor that most people reserve for a gym membership or an existential crisis. My knees ache, and my hands are raw, but the physical pain is a nice distraction. If I'm focusing on the burn in my muscles, I'm not focusing on the man standing 6 feet away. Alpha Cillian Cage. He's standing by the window, his silhouette cutting a jagged line against the morning sun. He looks like a statue carved from grief and granite. High cheekbones, shoulders broad enough to have their own zip code, and that brooding "I mused over a tragedy once" expression that makes the pack girls swoon and makes me want to throw a bucket of dirty mop water at his head. "You missed a spot, Rhea," a voice drawls. I don't look up. I don't need to. I know that voice. It belongs to Xander, the beta, a man whose personality is roughly 40% arrogance and 60% hair gel. I lean over and scrub the spot he pointed at, a perfectly clean patch of stone, with a silent internal curse. Being a mute servant has its perks. I don't have to laugh at his terrible jokes. "She doesn't talk much, does she?" Xander asks, stepping over my bucket. "She doesn't talk at all," Cillian's voice rumbles. It's a deep, gravelly sound that sends a traitorous shiver down my spine. It's the kind of voice that demands entry into your head and stays there. Now it's just the voice of a man who looks at me like I'm part of the furniture. To him, I'm just Rhea, the girl with the burn scar crawling up her neck and over her jaw, and the girl who keeps her head down and her mouth shut. "The wedding prep is a nightmare, Cillian," Xander continues, oblivious to the fact that I'm currently imagining his shoelaces tied together. Princess Isolde's family has arrived. Her father is already complaining about the draft in the guest quarters. He says a pack king should have better insulation. "The northern pack would complain if the sun were too bright," Cillian says, finally turning away from the window. His gray eyes land on me. For a second, just a heartbeat, his pupils blow wide. His wolf is sensing something. I hold my breath, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. "Don't smell the fear, smell the soap, smell the pine." "Rhea," he says. I freeze. I incline my head, keeping my eyes firmly on his boots. "The library needs to be cleared of the old records before the signing of the marriage contract tomorrow. Do it tonight. No one is to enter while you're there. I don't want the northern delegates sticking their noses into our archives." I nod once, gather my supplies, and scramble away as fast as my low-ranking persona allows. As I walk down the hall, I can feel his gaze lingering on the back of my neck. It's heavy, like the air before a lightning strike. The library is at the very top of the spire, a place of dust and forgotten history. It's the only room in the palace that hasn't been renovated since the Great Fire, 10 years ago. It still smells of old paper, and if you lean close to the walls, the faint lingering scent of charcoal. I'm not here to clean. I close the heavy oak doors and wait. I listen. The palace is a living thing. You can hear the heartbeat of the pack if you're quiet enough. The distant clatter of the kitchens, the howl of the recruits in the training yard, the heavy footsteps of the guards. When I'm sure I'm alone, I don't go for the bookshelves. I go for the floorboards. I count 3 boards from the fireplace, then 4 to the left. I kneel down, my fingers searching for a slight indentation. My fingernails catch on the edge. I pry. The wood groans, a dry, dusty sound that feels like a scream in the silence. The board pops up. I expect to find nothing, maybe some old dust bunnies or a mummified spider. Instead, I find a piece of shredded silk, blackened by heat. And then the smell hits me. Werewolves live and die by their noses. To a human, this would just smell like a dusty rag. To me, it's a map. Fire, smoke, blood, and something else. Heavy, musky scent. It's dark, like wet earth and rotted cedar. I know that scent. It belongs to the old king, Cillian's father. The man who supposedly hasn't been in this wing of the palace for a decade. "What are you doing, Rhea?" The voice is like a whip crack. I shove the silk into my apron pocket and slam the floorboard down, spinning around just as the door creaks open. Cillian is standing there. He doesn't have his alpha mask on. He looks tired. His hair is messy, and his shirt is unbuttoned at the collar. "I told you no one was to enter," he says softly, stepping into the room. "Including me, I suppose." I stand up, smoothing my apron, my heart thumping so hard I'm sure he can hear it. I give a small, jerky bow. "You have a habit of being where the shadows are thickest," he says, his eyes scanning the room, and he walks over to a leather armchair and slumped into it. He doesn't look at me, he looks at the empty fireplace. "Do you ever feel like the walls in this place are watching you, Rhea?" "Sometimes I think the stone has a better memory than the people living within it." I stand there, frozen. This is the most he's spoken to me in weeks. He's talking to me like a confidant, mostly because he thinks I can't talk back. "Tomorrow I marry a woman I don't know to satisfy a pack I don't trust," he mutters, rubbing his face with his hands. "My father says it's for the best. He says the purity of the cage line depends on this union. But every time I close my eyes, I smell smoke." He looks up at me then. His eyes are bloodshot. "You have a scar," he says, his voice dropping to a whisper. "On your neck. From the fire in the village?" I touch the jagged skin of my jaw, my fingers trembling. I shake my head. No. I can't tell him where it's from. I can't tell him that I was there the night his world ended. "You're lucky," he says. "The scars you can't see are the ones that never stop burning." He stands up then, moving toward me. He's fast, wolf fast. Before I can move, he's in my space. The scent of him flooded my senses. It's overwhelming. He reaches out, his hand hovering near my face. "There's something about you," he whispers. A scent under the soap. It's familiar. Like a song I forgot the words to. He leans in, his nose brushing against my temple. He takes a deep breath, and I know I'm caught. I know the soap won't be enough. My wolf is reacting to his proximity. His body stiffens. His hand drops to my shoulder, his grip tightening. "Wait," he breathes. "That scent. It's not possible." From the hallway, a piercing scream shattered the silence. It's high, thin, and full of terror. Cillian is out the door in a second, his alpha instincts taking over. I follow, my adrenaline spiking. We run down the spiral staircase, through the gallery, and toward the servants' entrance to the sublevels. A young maid is standing by the heavy iron door that leads to the old cellars, her face white as a sheet. The door," she gasps, pointing. I heard a noise. I thought it was a rat, but someone is scratching behind the stone. Cillian pushes past her, his shoulder slamming into the door. It doesn't budge. He growls, a low vibration that rattles my teeth. Curran throws his entire weight into it. The hinges scream as the door flies open. The air that hits us is cold, unnatural, bone-chilling cold. It smells of damp earth and something copper. Cillian grabs a torch from the wall. We descend. The sublevels are a labyrinth of stone. We turn a corner, and Cillian stops so abruptly I almost run into his back. The torchlight flickers over a hidden door, slightly ajar. Cillian pushes it open. Inside is a small, windowless room. There is no furniture, only a pile of straw in the corner and a man. He's hunched over, his back to us. He's shivering, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "Father," Cillian whispers, the torch trembling in his hand. The man turns around. It's the old king, but he's wrong. His jaw is elongated, his teeth jagged, his eyes wide and yellow. He's stuck halfway between man and wolf, his body frozen in a permanent, agonizing transformation. He sees us, and he doesn't roar. He lunges at Cillian, his movements jerky and feral. Cillian catches him, pinning him to the wall. "Father, it's me." The old king's eyes dart around the room, frantic. He looks at Cillian, then his gaze shifts to me, standing in the doorway. Recognition flares in those yellow eyes. A terror so pure it makes my blood run cold. He opens his mouth to speak, but only a wet, gurgling sound comes out. He reaches out a clawed hand, pointing not at Cillian, but at the shadows behind the door. He begins to scratch at the floor with his nails. Scritch, scritch, scritch. I kneel down, watching the marks. He isn't writing words. He draws a circle, then a line, then a jagged star. The crest of the northern pack. Isolde's family. I look up at Cillian, but he's looking at the door. Someone is standing there, a woman in a silk dress, her blonde hair perfectly coiffed. A small, amused smile on her lips. Princess Isolde. "Oh dear," she says, her voice like honey in glass. "I see you found the family's little secret. I told my father the basement was too drafty for him. Cillian let go of his father, his eyes glowing a dangerous amber. What did you do to him? Isolde steps into the room. Me? I didn't do anything, Cillian. Your father did this to himself. He was so desperate to keep his pure bloodline from being tainted that he tried to take something that didn't belong to him. Something silver. She looks at me then, her eyes boring into mine. And you, she says, her smile widening. You've been a very busy little servant, haven't you? Cleaning the floors, sneaking into the library. I wonder, Rhea, do you know what happens to people who stick their noses into the king's business? She takes a step toward me, and the air in the room suddenly feels very thin. The fire was 10 years ago, she whispers, her voice barely audible over the old king's whimpering. But some things just won't stay burned, will they? Cillian looks from Isolde to me, his face a mask of total confusion. Isolde, what are you talking about? She's just a servant. Isolde's smile doesn't reach her eyes. Is she Cillian? Or is she the reason your father is rotting in this cell? Behind Isolde, the shadows in the hallway begin to move. The sound of heavy footsteps echoes down the stone corridor. The northern guards weren't in the guest quarters. They were here, and they are growling. Isolde leans in, her breath hot against my ear. I don't know who you are yet, Rhea, she hisses. But by the time my guards are done with you, you'll be wishing you had stayed in the ash. Cillian steps in front of me, his wolf snarling. But the northern guards are already at the door, their eyes glowing in the dark. I reach into my pocket, my fingers brushing against the scorched silk. I don't know why I'm here. I don't know why the old king is pointing at me. But as the first northern wolf leaps, I realize one thing. The mystery of who I am is the only thing keeping me alive. And it's the one thing everyone in this room is willing to kill for. Chapter 2. The Weight of the Crown. The air in the cellar didn't just turn cold, it turned lethal. The smell of wet fur and aggression flooded the small, cramped room, thick enough to choke on. Cillian stood like a wall of muscle and protective fury between me and the northern guards, his back a broad expanse of tension. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs, but my hands stayed steady. A servant would scream, a servant would cower. I just tightened my grip on the scorched silk in my pocket and waited for the first drop of blood to hit the stone. Cillian, move, Isolde said, her voice as casual as if she were asking him to pass the salt at dinner. She's a spy. She's been digging into things that are far above her station. My guards will take her to the border for questioning. Questioning. Cillian's growl wasn't human. It was a low-frequency vibration that made the torchlight flicker. You bring shifted wolves into my private sublevels to question a palace servant. You're overstepping. Na Isolde, this is my pack, and she is my subject. She's a liability, Isolde snapped, her mask of perfection finally cracking. Look at your father, look at what's left of him. Do you think it's a coincidence she was found hovering over him while he's in this state? She's been poisoning the well, Cillian, literally. I looked at the old king. He was still backed into the corner, his yellow eyes darting between me and Isolde. He wasn't pointing at me anymore. He was shivering, a pathetic whimpering sound leaking from his elongated throat. He looked terrified of her. That was the first piece of the puzzle that didn't fit. If he was the one who had tried to take my silver power 10 years ago, why was he cowering before a northern princess now? One of the northern guards, a massive wolf with fur the color of curdled milk, took a predatory step forward. His claws clicked against the stone, a dry, rhythmic sound that announced his intent. He didn't look at Cillian. He looked at my throat. I said, Cillian's voice dropped to a whisper that was somehow louder than a shout. Move back! The guard didn't move back. He lunged. Everything happened in a blur of gray and shadow. Cillian didn't shift, not fully, but his speed was supernatural. He caught the wolf midair, his hands locking around the creature's throat. With a roar of effort, he slammed the massive beast into the stone wall. The impact was sickening. The wolf slumped, unconscious or dead, as Cillian turned his glare on the remaining 3 guards. Who else wants to test the laws of hospitality in my home? Cillian demanded. The guards hesitated. They were alphas in their own right, and handpicked by the Northern King, but Cillian was something else. He was a king alpha, a lineage that didn't just lead, it dominated. Isolde's face went pale, her eyes flashing with a cold, calculating rage. You would strike my men for a mute girl with a ruined face. You're making a mistake, Cillian. A diplomatic disaster. The disaster started when you entered this room without an invitation, Cillian countered. He reached back, his hand finding my wrist. His grip was like iron, but it wasn't meant to hurt. He was anchoring me. Rhea, move, now. He didn't have to tell me twice. I didn't play the damsel. I moved with the silent efficiency I'd spent years perfecting. As we backed out of the cell, Cillian kept his eyes on the guards, his chest heaving. We retreated into the dark corridor, at the sound of Isolde's sharp commands echoing behind us. Find her, she screamed. Don't let that girl leave the palace. Cillian didn't lead me toward the stairs. He dragged me deeper into the labyrinth. We took turns I didn't recognize, through tunnels that smelled of damp moss and ancient decay. My lungs were burning, but I kept pace. Finally, he shoved me into a small alcove behind a heavy tapestry and pressed his body against mine, his hand covering my mouth. Stay still, his eyes commanded. We stood in the suffocating darkness, heart to heart. I could feel the heat radiating off him, the way his pulse was racing at a speed that would have killed a human. His scent, rain and ozone, was so thick, it felt like I was breathing him in. For a moment, the 10 years of bitterness and ash vanished. For a moment, I wasn't Rhea. He wasn't the king who failed me. We were just two wolves in the dark, hunted by the same monster. He slowly pulled his hand away from my mouth. His face was inches from mine. You're going to tell me what's happening, he whispered, his voice raw. I don't care if you have to write it in the dirt. My father he's been missing for months. My beta told me he was in a private sanitarium in the south, but he was here, and he was terrified of you. I shook my head. I mimed the scratching motion his father had made on the floor, the northern crest. Isolde, Cillian breathed, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. She's been keeping him there, but why? My father hated the north. He would never have allowed this merger if he were in his right mind. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the piece of scorched silk. I didn't give it to him. I just let him see it in the dim light filtering through the tapestry. He reached out, his fingers trembling as he touched the fabric. This belonged to her, to Thora. His eyes snapped to mine, and for the first time, I saw the cracks in his soul. The grief he'd been hiding behind his ruthless mask was a gaping wound. Where did you find this? He asked. Why do you have it? I didn't answer. I couldn't. Not yet. If I told him the truth, the Northern Pack wouldn't be the only ones hunting me. The Cage Pack would see a ghost Luna as a threat to their stability. Suddenly, the floor beneath us vibrated. A low, rhythmic thumping. Pause. Many pause. They're searching the lower levels, Cillian hissed. He looked at the tunnel ahead, then back at me. I can't take you to the guest rooms. They'll find you. And I can't keep you with me without raising suspicion from the delegates. He grabbed a heavy iron key from his belt and pressed it into my hand. The old guard tower, he said. It's been condemned since the fire. No one goes there because they think the structure is unstable. Go to the top floor. There's a hidden room behind the weapon racks. Wait for me there. I looked at the key, then at him. I wanted to tell him that the tower was where I'd almost died. I wanted to tell him that going back there was like stepping into my own grave. Rhea, he said, his voice softening for a split second. Trust me, just this once. I didn't have a choice. I nodded, tucked the key into my sash, and disappeared into the shadows before he could change his mind. Getting to the tower was a nightmare of evasion. I moved through the servant passages, pressing myself into the stone every time a patrol passed. The palace was on high alert. I heard snippets of conversation. The king has lost his mind. The northern princess is demanding blood. Find the mute girl. I was a ghost in my own home. The tower loomed against the night sky like a charred finger pointing at the moon. It was a skeletal ruin, the stone blackened and crumbling. The entrance was boarded up, but I found the loose plank I'd used as a child. I slipped inside. The smell of ash hit me like a physical punch to the gut. The fire, the screaming, the sound of the door being locked from the outside. I forced myself to move. Every step up the winding stairs felt like a victory over my own fear. The wood groaned under my feet, and the wind whistled through the gaps in the masonry. Finally, I reached the top. The hidden room was a small chamber used by the archers in the old days. It was cold and filled with the skeletons of old furniture. I sat on the floor, pulling my knees to my chest, and waited. Hours passed. The moon climbed higher, casting long, skeletal shadows across the floor. I pulled out the silk shawl again. Why had the old king kept it? Why was it hidden in the library floorboards? If he had tried to kill me to steal my power, he wouldn't have kept a trophy. He would have burned it. I ran my fingers over the silk, and that's when I felt it. A lump. In the hem of the shawl, something hard was sewn into the fabric. I didn't have a knife, so I used my teeth to tear the ancient, weakened threads. A small silver ring fell out. It wasn't a wedding ring, it was a signet ring. But the crest was worn flat, as if someone had spent years rubbing it with their thumb. I held it up to the moonlight. There was an inscription on the inside, to my shadow. May the moon never find you. My breath hitched. That wasn't a cage motto, that was something else. Suddenly, the door to the room creaked open. I scrambled to my feet, my back against the wall, my hand moving to the heavy iron key to use as a makeshift weapon. It wasn't Cillian. Xander, the beta, stood in the doorway. He wasn't wearing his hair gel or his smug smile. He looked disheveled, his eyes wild and bloodshot. I knew I'd find you here, he said, his voice shaking. Cillian always was predictable. He thinks this tower is a sanctuary. He forgot that I'm the one who helped him board it up 10 years ago. I didn't move. I kept my eyes on him, watching for the shift. You're a problem. Rhea, Xander said, taking a step into the room. A big, scarred, silent problem. Isolde wants your head on a platter, and frankly, I'm tired of cleaning up Cillian's messes. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small vial of clear liquid. The old king didn't get stuck in a half shift by accident, Xander whispered. A dark, twisted grin spreading across his face. He was the first test. The serum, it freezes the wolf. It traps the soul in a cage of bone. It's quite poetic, really. He started toward me, the vial held high. Don't worry, he said. I won't kill you. I'm just going to make sure you can never tell Cillian what you found in that cellar. I backed up, but there was nowhere to go. My heels hit the edge of the stone window frame. Below me, 100-foot drop into the jagged rocks of the ravine. Xander lunged. I didn't cower, I didn't scream. I waited until he was inches away, and then I did the one thing he didn't expect. I didn't dodge. I tackled him. We hit the floor hard, the vial flying from his hand and shattering against the stone. The liquid hissed, eating into the rock like acid. Xander roared in frustration, his fingers digging into my shoulders, his wolf eyes flashing. You little bitch. He raised his hand to strike me, but he stopped. His gaze fell on the silver ring that had rolled across the floor during our struggle. His face went from rage to absolute, paralyzing terror. Where did you get that? He gasped, his voice barely a whisper. That belongs to the Kingslayers. He scrambled back, away from the ring as if it were white-hot iron. He looked at me, his eyes wide, looking past the scars, past the servant's rags. You're not a servant, he breathed. You're one of them. Before I could move, the floor beneath us gave a sickening crack. The structural instability Cillian had mentioned wasn't a myth. The weight of our struggle, combined with the years of decay, was too much. The stone beneath Xander's feet disintegrated. He didn't even have time to scream. He vanished into the darkness of the tower's hollow center. I lunged for the edge, my fingers catching the crumbling masonry. I hung there, suspended over the abyss, my muscles screaming in protest. And then, from the doorway, I heard a slow, rhythmic clapping. I looked up, my vision blurring with exhaustion. Isolde was standing there, watching me dangle. She wasn't alone. Behind her stood 2 more northern guards, their muzzles dripping with saliva. Well, that was entertaining, she said, leaning against the doorframe. Xander always was a bit too clumsy for his own good, but he was right about one thing. She walked over and picked up the silver ring, holding it up to the light. This ring changes everything, she said. It means I don't just have to kill you. I have to make sure you never existed at all. She looked at her guards and gave a small, elegant wave of her hand. Finish it. And make sure the king thinks it was an accident. The guards moved forward, their shadows stretching over me like a shroud. My fingers slipped an inch. The stone crumbled. And then, the sound of a roar, not from the guards, but from the forest below, shook the very foundation of the tower. It was a howl of pure, unadulterated agony and rage. Cillian. Isolde froze, her eyes widening. He's found the old king's body. She looked back at me, as a cruel glint in her eyes. Too late for you, though. She stepped on my fingers, her heel grinding into my knuckles. I let go. Chapter 3. The Ghost in the Ravine. Falling is a strange thing. People think it's fast, a blur of air and terror, but for a wolf, time stretches like pulled taffy. As my fingers lost their grip on the crumbling masonry of the tower and Isolde's triumphant face receded into a pinprick of moonlight, I didn't feel fear. I felt a cold, sharp clarity. The wind whipped my hair across my face, stinging the scar on my jaw. And for the first time in 10 years, I let the silence break. I didn't scream, I shifted. It wasn't a full transformation. I didn't have the space or the bone density to survive a total shift midair without shattering. But I let the spirit of the wolf flood my muscles, and my reflexes sharpened to a lethal edge. As the jagged rocks of the ravine rushed up to meet me, I twisted my body, aiming for the narrow, fast-moving ribbon of the Cage River that cut through the canyon floor. I hit the water like a stone thrown by a giant. The cold was an immediate, paralyzing weight. It slammed the air out of my lungs and dragged me down into the churning, black depths. The current was a living thing, a muscular beast that tossed me against the smooth river stones and pulled me toward the jagged debris of the falls downstream. I fought, my lungs burning, my vision spotting with red. Not like this, I thought, my claws scraping against the riverbed. I didn't survive the fire just to drown in a ditch because a blonde princess stepped on my fingers. With a desperate final surge of strength, I snagged a submerged tree root. The wood was slick with silt, but I held on until my shoulder felt like it was being pulled from its socket. Slowly, agonizingly, I hauled myself onto a narrow, muddy bank, hidden beneath the overhang of the canyon wall. I lay there for a long time, coughing up river water and shivering so violently my teeth rattled. My servant's rags were shredded, clinging to my skin like a second, colder layer of failure. But I was alive. Above me, the silhouette of the tower looked like a broken tooth against the moon. I could hear the distant, haunting echo of Cillian's howl still bouncing off the canyon walls. It was a sound of absolute ruin. He'd found his father. He'd found the truth in the cellar, but he thought he'd lost me in the tower. I reached into my pocket, my heart stopping for a second. The ring, the signet ring, it was still there. I pulled it out, the silver cold and mocking in my palm. To my shadow, may the moon never find you. I wasn't just a survivor anymore. I was a Kingslayer. The realization felt like a heavy cloak. The Kingslayers weren't just a myth told to scare unruly pups. They were the failsafe, the shadows meant to prune the family tree when the alphas grew too rotten. If that was my heritage, then my entire life, the fire, the weak bloodline, the exile, wasn't an accident. It was a hunt. I forced myself to stand. My left ankle was definitely sprained, and my ribs felt like they'd been used for target practice. But a fierce wolf doesn't stay down. I needed to get back to the palace, not as Rhea, but as a predator. The climb out of the ravine took hours. I moved like a ghost, sticking to the deep shadows cast by the ancient oaks. By the time I reached the outskirts of the pack settlement, the sun was beginning to bleed over the horizon, painting the sky in bruises of purple and orange. The palace was in total chaos. I could smell the agitation from half a mile away, bitter sweat, sharp adrenaline, and the metallic tang of unsheathed steel. The northern guards were everywhere, standing in formation at the gates. They weren't guests anymore. They were an occupying force. I slipped through a drainage grate that led to the kitchens. I was covered in mud, blood, and river silt. I looked less like a maid and more like something that had crawled out of a nightmare. "Rhea?" The whisper came from the darkness of the pantry. I spun around, my hand catching a heavy iron skillet from the counter before I even realized I'd moved. It was the young maid from the cellar, the one who had heard the scratching. Her eyes were wide, and she looked like she'd been crying. "You're alive?" she breathed, rushing forward. They said you fell. The princess told the king you jumped because you were guilty of poisoning the old king." I gripped her arm, my eyes hard. I didn't need a voice to ask the question. "Where is he?" "The king is in the great hall," she whispered, understanding my silent demand. Rhea, he's not himself. He's challenged the Northern Alpha. He says the marriage is off. The North is claiming it's an act of war. They've locked the doors. No one goes in or out." I pushed past her, heading for the service stairs. "Wait," she called out, reaching into her apron. "You dropped this in the hallway yesterday." She handed me a small, wooden-handled knife. It was a common paring blade, nothing like the silver steel weapons the guards carried, but in my hand, it felt like a promise. I tucked it into my sash and kept moving. The great hall was a fortress within a fortress. I could hear the shouting before I reached the gallery. "You would break a blood oath for a servant?" a booming, unfamiliar voice roared. "That would be King Soren, Isolde's father. You found your father mad and dying, Cillian. That is a tragedy, but it does not excuse the insult to my daughter." My father was silenced. Cillian's voice was a thunderclap, vibrating the very floorboards beneath my feet. He was kept in a cage like an animal in my own home, And the only person who tried to show me the truth is dead because your guards chased her into a ruin. She was a spy, Isolde's voice rang out, sharp and high. She had the Kingslayer mark, Cillian. Do you even realize what that means? She wasn't here to serve you. She was here to end your line. I reached the gallery railing, staying flat against the stone. Below me, the scene was a tinderbox. Cillian stood in the center of the hall, his clothes torn, his eyes a brilliant, burning amber. He looked magnificent and terrifying, a king pushed to the very edge of his sanity. Opposite him stood King Soren, a massive white-haired wolf of a man, surrounded by a dozen northern alphas. Isolde stood to the side, looking remarkably composed given the circumstances. She held the signet ring I'd dropped in the tower. This ring was found in her possession, Isolde said, holding it up for the room to see. Proof. She was a plant from the southern rebels. She seduced you with her silence, while she worked her poison on your father. She didn't seduce me, Cillian growled. Taking a step toward her, the northern guards shifted, their hands moving to their belts. She was the only thing in this palace that didn't smell like a lie. Enough. Soren stepped forward, his presence filling the room. The marriage will proceed today, or the northern pack will consider the cage territory a hostile land. We have the numbers, Cillian. Don't let your obsession with a dead girl destroy your people. Cillian looked around the room. His own pack members, my people, were looking at the floor. They were afraid. They saw the northern numbers, and they saw their king falling apart. They were ready to let him marry a murderer just to keep the peace. My blood boiled. This was the moment. The shadow was supposed to stay hidden, but the Luna was supposed to lead. I didn't climb down the stairs. I leaped from the gallery. I landed on the long banquet table with a crash that sent silver plates and wine goblets flying. The sound was like a gunshot in the silent hall. Every head in the room snapped toward me. I stood up slowly, the mud and blood drying on my skin, my shredded clothes fluttering in the draft. I looked directly at Cillian. For a heartbeat, the amber in his eyes flickered, replaced by a shock so profound he actually stumbled back a step. Rhea, he whispered. I didn't look at him for long. I turned my gaze to Isolde. I saw the moment her triumph turned to ash. Her face went from pale to ghostly white, her mouth falling open. I walked down the length of the table, my limp barely noticeable through the sheer force of my will. I stepped off the end, landing inches away from King Soren. He was a foot taller than me, a mountain of muscle, but I didn't blink. I reached out my hand toward Isolde. I didn't say a word. I just beckoned for the ring. Stay back, you monster, Isolde shrieked, clutching the ring to her chest. Guards, kill her, she's the Kingslayer. The northern guards hesitated. They looked at Cillian, then at Soren. In the cage hall, only the king's command was law. Touch her, Cillian said, his voice dropping to a deadly quiet register, and I will personally tear the heart out of every man in this room. He walked toward me, his movements slow, as if he were afraid I'd vanish if he moved too fast. He stopped right in front of me. He reached out, his thumb brushing the mud from my cheek. You're alive, he breathed. I nodded. Then I did something I hadn't done in 10 years. I took a deep breath, ignored the searing pain in my scarred throat, and spoke. My voice was a rasp, a dry sound like dead leaves on pavement, but it was clear. The ring, I said, is mine. The room gasped. A mute servant speaking was a miracle. A dead girl coming back to claim a Kingslayer relic was a revolution. It belongs to the southern line, Soren roared, trying to regain control. It is a weapon of the rebels. It belongs, I said, my voice growing stronger, to the girl who was promised to the cage throne, the girl who was burned out of her own nursery, while her fated mate was led away by traitors. I looked at Cillian. I saw the realization hit him. I saw the memory of the fire, the memory of the girl he'd loved, and the face of the woman standing before him finally clicked together. Thora, he whispered, his voice breaking. She's lying, Isolde screamed, her voice bordering on hysterical. Thora is dead. This is a trick, a southern glamour, I ignored her. I looked at the old king, who had been brought into the hall in chains, still stuck in his agonizing half-shift. He was whimpering, his yellow eyes fixed on me. I walked over to him. The guards tried to block me, but Cillian moved like a blur, throwing them aside. I knelt in front of the man who had ruined my life. I reached out and touched his matted fur. He flinched, but I didn't pull away. You didn't want to kill me, I whispered, so only he could hear. You wanted the power. You thought the silver would make you immortal. I leaned in closer. But the silver doesn't belong to a king who hides in the dark. It belongs to the shadow who protects the pack. I stood up and turned to the room. I reached into my sash and pulled out the small paring knife. A trial of truth, I announced, my voice ringing through the hall. If I am a liar, let the cage earth reject my blood. But if I am the true Luna, let the north answer for their crimes. I didn't wait for an answer. I sliced the palm of my hand. In a normal wolf, the blood is dark red. In a kingslayer, when the power is called, it's different. The blood that hit the stone floor wasn't red. It was a brilliant, shimmering silver. It didn't pool. It hissed against the stone, the liquid light spreading out in a perfect circle around me. The silence that followed was absolute. Even Soren backed away. The silver blood was a legend, like a mark of the primal alphas who had founded the packs before the lines grew thin and weak. Cillian dropped to one knee, then Xander, who had survived his fall and was lurking in the back, slowly sank to the floor. One by one, the cage wolves began to bow. Not to their king, but to the silver. I looked at Isolde. She was trembling so hard, the signet ring fell from her hand, clattering onto the stone. The merger is over, I said, my voice cold as ice. And the north has 1 hour to leave our lands before the hunt begins. Soren snarled, his wolf features beginning to emerge. You think a drop of shiny blood scares me? You're 2 wolves against an army. Not 2, a new voice boomed. The great hall's massive front doors creaked open. Standing there was the beta of the southern pack, flanked by 50 warriors. They weren't in uniform. They were in war paint. The southern pack is here for their princess, the beta announced. But as he spoke, I noticed something. He wasn't looking at me with loyalty. He was looking at Cillian with a hunger that made my skin crawl. I realized then that the South hadn't come to rescue me. They had come to claim the cage territory while it was weak. I looked at Cillian. He saw it too. We were surrounded by enemies on both sides. The North who wanted us dead, and the South who wanted our throne. And then, the old king did something no one expected. He let out a scream that wasn't a whimper. It was a call. From the shadows of the rafters, hundreds of small, glowing yellow eyes appeared. Not wolves, not humans, something else. The half-shifts, the failed experiments the old king had been hiding for years, began to drop from the ceiling like spiders. They didn't attack the north. They didn't attack the south. They formed a circle around me and Cillian, their jagged teeth bared at everyone. The king's guard, Cillian whispered, his hand finding mine. His grip was tight, desperate. Rhea, Thora, what have we started? Before I could answer, the ground beneath the palace began to groan. A deep seismic vibration that suggested the sublevels weren't just cells. They were a cage for something much, much bigger. The silver blood on the floor began to glow, and for the first time in my life, I felt my wolf truly wake up. She didn't want peace, she wanted the throne. Chapter 4. The King's Shadow. The ground didn't just shake, it roared. It was a sound from the deep, a tectonic protest that rattled the ancient foundation of Cage Palace, until the massive chandeliers above the great hall swayed like pendulums of death. The silver blood I'd spilled, my blood, was no longer just sitting on the stone, it was pulsing. Every time the floor groaned, the shimmering liquid hissed, spreading thin metallic veins into the cracks of the rock as if it were looking for a way home. Cillian's hand was a crushing weight around mine. His palm was hot, his pulse erratic, but his eyes were fixed on the rafters. The half-shifts, those twisted, agonizing failures of his father's ambition, were no longer whimpering. They were waiting. They clung to the stone pillars and the wooden beams with elongated clawed limbs, their yellow eyes reflecting the silver glow from the floor, and they looked like a nightmare's version of a royal guard. Cillian, I rasped, my voice still a dry, painful scrape against my throat. The floor, we need to move. He didn't move. He was staring at the southern beta, Kyle, who stood at the entrance with 50 warriors. Kyle wasn't bowing. He wasn't even looking at the silver blood with the reverence the others were. He was smiling. It was the smile of a man who had just seen his enemy's house start to burn and realized he had brought the matches. The silver Luna returns, Kale called out, his voice echoing over the seismic rumbling. And she brings the monsters of the basement with her. Is this the future of the cage pack, Cillian? A king who hides a deformed father and a queen who bleeds liquid treason? The only treason here is yours, Kyle, Cillian roared, finally stepping forward. And he didn't let go of my hand. You cross my border without an invitation. You speak to my mate with a silver tongue. And you expect to leave with your head? Mate, Isolde's voice shrieked from the side. She was scrambling backward, her silk dress torn at the hem, her eyes darting between the ceiling crawlers and the silver blood. She is a kingslayer. She is the end of us all. Soren, do something. King Soren of the North didn't need to be told twice. He was a mountain of a man, and he didn't care about ancient prophecies or shimmering blood. He cared about power. With a roar that shook the remaining glass in the windows, he began to shift. It wasn't the elegant, controlled transformation of a King Alpha. It was a violent explosion of fur and bone. His clothes shredded as his torso expanded, his jaw elongating into a massive, white-furred muzzle dripping with saliva. The North followed their king. The South followed their greed. In an instant, the great hall became a kill box. Rhea, Thora, behind me, Cillian commanded, his own body rippling with the strain of holding back his shift. He needed to stay human to lead, but the wolf was screaming for blood. I don't hide behind anyone, I snapped. I pulled the small wooden-handled knife from my sash. It looked like a toothpick compared to the massive wolves surrounding us, but I wasn't planning on winning with steel. I closed my eyes and reached for the silver. It wasn't magic. I'd promised myself I wouldn't call it that. It was blood. It was biology. It was the ancient, dormant frequency of the first alphas that had been suppressed by centuries of purity and politics. I felt a cold, air metallic hum start at the base of my skull and radiate down my spine. Stop them, I thought. The half-shifts dropped. They didn't fall like rocks. They fell like predators. One landed squarely on the back of a northern wolf, its elongated fingers digging into the creature's eyes. Another swung from a chandelier, kicking a southern warrior across the room with a strength that shouldn't have been possible for its emaciated frame. The hall became a symphony of snarls, breaking wood, and the wet thud of bodies hitting stone. Cillian moved like a blur of lethal grace. He didn't shift, but he used his alpha strength to intercept Soren. The two of them collided in the center of the hall, a man against a beast. Cillian caught Soren's massive paws, his boots sliding back against the stone as he fought to keep the white wolf from snapping his neck. "At go!" Cillian yelled at me over his shoulder, his face turning a dark, bruised purple from the effort. The sublevels, the vibration is coming from the vault. I didn't want to leave him. Every instinct I had, the fated bond I'd tried to deny for a decade, screamed at me to stay and tear Soren's throat out. But the ground gave another violent lurch, and a crack opened up right beneath the banquet table, swallowing a silver tureen whole. I turned and ran. I didn't go for the main stairs. I went for the servants' passage behind the throne. I could hear Isolde screaming for her guards to follow me. I could hear Kyle's laughter. But mostly, I could hear the heartbeat of the palace. It was slowing down. It was heavy. I reached the sublevel door, the iron cold against my palm. I didn't need a key this time, and the lock had been shattered by the tremors. I threw it open and descended into the dark. The smell of damp earth was gone, replaced by something sharp and electric. As I reached the bottom of the stairs, I realized the cellar where the old king had been kept was just the beginning. The back wall of the cell had crumbled away, revealing a tunnel that wasn't made of cage stone. It was made of obsidian, and it was glowing. Veins of silver light, identical to my blood, were pulsing through the dark rock. They all led to a single, massive door at the end of the passage. The door was etched with a single symbol, a wolf's head with a silver eye. So, the rumors were true, a voice whispered from the shadows behind me. I spun around, my knife raised. Xander stepped out of the dark. He was limping, his clothes a tattered mess from his fall in the tower, one arm hanging uselessly at his side. He looked like a man who had seen the end of the world and decided to take a front row seat. "The Kingslayer isn't a title for an assassin, is it, Thora?" Xander asked, his voice hollow. "It's a title for a key." "Where is the beta who was supposed to be Cillian's friend?" I asked, my voice steady despite the adrenaline. "The Xander who didn't try to poison a mute girl? He died in the fire 10 years ago," Xander said. And for a second, I saw a flash of genuine grief in his eyes. The old king promised me a world where we weren't just servants to a bloodline that was fading. He told me that if we unlocked what was beneath this palace, we would never have to bow again. But he couldn't open it. He tried to use your blood back then. But you were too young. The power wasn't ripe. He looked at the obsidian door. He spent 10 years trying to replicate your scent, your frequency. He went mad trying to force his own shift to match yours. That's why he's a monster now. He tried to be a god without a soul. And what are you trying to be, Xander? Alive, he said simply. He lunged. Even with one arm, Xander was a beta. He was faster than I expected. He slammed me against the obsidian wall, his hand locking around my throat. I stabbed upward with the paring knife, but he caught my wrist, his grip crushing the bone. I gasped, the knife clattering to the floor. I don't want to kill you, Xander hissed, his face inches from mine. I just need your hand on that door, one drop. And that's all it takes to open the vault and end this war. You think whatever is in there is going to help you? I choked out. It's called the Kingslayer Vault for a reason, Xander. It's not a treasure chest. It's a cage. Then we'll all be in the cage together. He dragged me toward the door. I fought, kicking at his shins, trying to shift my weight, but he was driven by a desperate, manic strength. He pressed my bleeding palm against the cold obsidian of the wolf's head. The reaction was instantaneous. The silver veins in the wall surged with a blinding light. The obsidian door didn't slide open. It dissolved. A wave of pressure hit us, throwing Xander backward into the darkness. I was pulled forward, sucked into the room by a vacuum of cold, silent air. I hit the floor of the vault, my breath leaving me in a wheeze. And the room was silent. Absolutely, terrifyingly silent. The tremors had stopped. The shouting from the great hall was a muffled, distant memory. I looked up. The vault wasn't filled with gold or ancient weapons. It was a library. Thousands of glass jars lined the walls, each one containing a swirling silver mist. In the center of the room stood a single stone pedestal, and sitting on that pedestal was a crown. It wasn't made of gold or jewels. It was made of bone, the vertebrae of a giant wolf, bleached white and polished to a mirror finish. It didn't look like a symbol of royalty. It looked like a trap. Beautiful, isn't it? I spun around. The old king was standing there. He wasn't hunched over. He wasn't whimpering. His body had straightened. His jagged teeth had retracted, and his yellow eyes were clear. He looked like a king again. But there was something missing. He had no scent, no heartbeat. He was a hollowed-out shell of a man. "You're not my father-in-law," I whispered, my hand moving to the silver ring in my pocket. "I am the memory of what this pack used to be," the man said, his voice echoing from everywhere at once. "And you are the girl who was supposed to bring the end. Tell me, Thora, do you know why the silver line was hunted? Because you were afraid of them." "No," he smiled, a cold, terrifying expression. "Because we were jealous. The silver eye doesn't just see the truth. It commands the shift. A silver Luna can force an alpha back into his human form with a single look. She can make a pack turn on its king. She is the ultimate imbalance." He stepped toward the pedestal. "At the north and the south are fighting for a throne that doesn't exist anymore. The moment you open this door, the cage pack ceased to be. The frequency has been released." "What does that mean?" "It means every wolf within 10 miles is currently experiencing a forced shift," he said. "The pain will be unbearable. Their bones will break and reset over and over until they accept a new alpha. Or until they die." My heart plummeted. "Cillian. Cillian is up there," I screamed, moving toward the exit. "He's fighting Soren." "He's already changing," the old king said. "And so are you." I felt it then, a white-hot needle of pain in my femur, then another in my jaw. I fell to my knees, my breath hitching. My bones were grinding against each other, the silver in my blood turning into liquid fire. "The crown," the old king whispered. I'm pointing to the bone circle. "Put it on, Thora. Stop the pain. Command the shift. Become the monster they always said you were." I looked at the crown. I could feel its pull, a magnetic, dark attraction. If I put it on, I could stop the agony. I could save Cillian. I could kill Soren and Cal with a thought. But I looked at the old king's empty eyes, and I knew the cost. To command the shift was to lose your own. I would be a queen, but I would never be a wolf again. I would be a silent silver statue on a throne of bone. I reached for the crown. My fingers were inches away. The ceiling of the vault exploded. A massive white furred shape crashed through the stone, followed by a dark, snarling blur. Soren and Cillian had fallen through the floor of the great hall, at their fight continuing even as their bodies were being racked by the forced shift. They were both in a horrific state of mid-transformation, limbs too long, fur patchy, eyes glowing with a maddened, agonizing light. Soren saw the crown. Even in his madness, he knew what it was. He lunged for the pedestal, his massive claws swiping at my head. Cillian tackled him mid-air, his teeth sinking into Soren's shoulder. They tumbled across the vault floor, crashing into the glass jars. The silver mist escaped, filling the room with a shimmering, blinding fog. Thora, Cillian's voice was a guttural, inhuman roar. He was pinned beneath Soren, the white wolf's jaws closing around Cillian's throat. The crown! Destroy it! I looked at the bone crown, then I looked at the man I loved, who was about to die because of an ancient blood debt I never asked for. I didn't grab the crown to wear it. I grabbed the pedestal. With a scream of pure, silver-fueled rage, I tipped the heavy stone block. The bone crown fell to the floor, and I brought my heel down on it with everything I had. The sound was like a thunderclap. The bone shattered into 1,000 white splinters. A shockwave of silver light erupted from the broken crown, throwing everyone back. The jars on the walls exploded simultaneously. The silver mist became a cyclone, swirling around the room, screaming with the voices of 1,000 dead alphas. The pain in my bones intensified until the world went white. When I opened my eyes, the vault was silent again. The glowing obsidian had gone dark. The old king was gone, vanished like a ghost in the wind. When the silver mist had settled into a fine sparkling dust on the floor, I pushed myself up, my body feeling heavy and bruised, but the force shift had stopped. My bones felt like mine again. I looked across the room. Soren was lying in a heap of white fur, unconscious or dead. Cillian was slumped against the far wall. He was human, his skin pale and covered in scratches, but he was breathing. His eyes were closed. Cillian, I whispered, crawling toward him. I reached him and pulled his head into my lap. He groaned, his eyes fluttering open. The amber was gone, replaced by his natural warm gray. Did you do it?" he asked, his voice a mere thread. "It's gone," I said, tears blurring my vision. "The crown is broken. The vault is empty." He reached up, his fingers brushing the hair away from my face. He looked at the scar on my jaw, and for the first time, he didn't look at it with pity. He looked at it like a map of where we'd been. "You're not Rhea anymore," he said. "No," I whispered. "I'm Thora." We sat there in the dark, the silence of the vault finally feeling like peace. But as I looked up at the hole in the ceiling, I realized the silence was too loud. I didn't hear the fighting in the Great Hall. I didn't hear the northern wolves. I didn't hear the south. I stood up, helping Cillian to his feet. We climbed through the rubble, back into the Great Hall. The room was empty. The banquet tables were overturned. The tapestries were burned, but there wasn't a single body. No north, no south, no half-shifts. It was as if the entire pack had vanished into thin air. "Where is everyone?" Cillian asked. His voice echoing in the hollow space. I walked to the massive front doors and pushed them open. The sun was fully up now, but the world outside wasn't the cage territory I remembered. The forest was gone. In its place was a vast, shimmering silver desert that stretched as far as the eye could see. And standing in the middle of that desert, thousands of wolves were perfectly still, their heads tilted back, their eyes fixed on a moon that was still visible in the daylight sky. A moon that was turning blood red. Cillian stepped out beside me, his hand tightening on mine. "Thora," he whispered, "what did you do when you broke that crown?" I looked at the red moon, and I felt a new, cold sensation in the pit of my stomach. My wolf wasn't screaming anymore, she was purring. "I didn't just break a crown, Cillian," I said, but my voice sounding like someone else's. "I broke the world." From the horizon, a single, massive howl erupted. It wasn't a wolf. It was something much, much bigger, and it was coming for us. Chapter 5. The Red Moon's Hunger. Standing on the threshold of the palace, the world felt like a cruel joke. The lush pine-scented forests of my childhood, the ones I'd bled for, the ones I'd dreamed of while hiding in the ashes, were gone. In their place was a vast, undulating sea of silver sand that glittered with a cold metallic light. It was beautiful in the way a sharpened blade is beautiful. It promised nothing but a clean cut. And then there were the wolves. Hundreds of them, from the north, the south, and our own cage kin, stood like frozen statues in the dunes. They didn't move, they didn't blink, but their gazes were locked on that impossible red moon hanging in the noonday sky. Their souls seemingly sucked out by the very thing I had unleashed. Cillian's grip on my hand was so tight, I could feel the individual bones of his fingers. He was shaking, not from fear, but from the sheer sensory overload of a world that had rewritten its own laws, while we were underground. "They're not breathing," Cillian whispered, his voice cracking. "Thora, look at them. Their hearts. I can't hear their hearts." He was right. The rhythmic drumbeat of a pack, that low-level hum of life that usually filled the air around the palace, had been replaced by a silence so heavy it made my ears ring. I stepped down from the stone portico, my boots crunching on the silver sand. It didn't feel like sand. It felt like crushed glass and old memories. It's the frequency, I said, the words feeling heavy on my tongue. The crown was a dampener. It kept the primal energy of the silver line contained. By breaking it, I didn't just stop the shift, Cillian. I broadcasted it. I looked up at the red moon. It wasn't just a color, it was a wound in the sky. It throbbed with a slow, deep rhythm that felt uncomfortably like my own pulse. Acknowledge me, the moon seemed to hum. Suddenly, the massive howl that had ended the silence echoed again, closer this time. It wasn't just one voice. It was a discordance of 1,000 screams, layered over a single terrifying bass note. From the edge of the silver horizon, the sand began to churn. Something is coming, Cillian said, his eyes narrowing. He stepped in front of me, his body automatically falling into a defensive stance, despite the fact that he was barely holding himself upright. And it's not a wolf. The silver dunes erupted. Gigantic shapes, easily 3 times the size of a standard alpha wolf, burst from the sand. They were horrific, beings made of translucent silver mist and jagged bone, their forms shifting and flickering like bad reception. They had no eyes, only gaping maws that dripped with the same liquid silver that flowed in my veins. The Voidwalkers, I breathed, the names surfacing from a part of my brain I hadn't accessed since I was a pup listening to my grandmother's forbidden stories. The original predators, the things the silver line was meant to hunt. You mean the things that were meant to hunt us, Cillian corrected. The creatures didn't bark or snarl. They let out a high-pitched electronic shriek that felt like a needle being driven into my brain. They ignored the frozen wolves in the dunes, moving with terrifying speed toward the palace, toward us. Back inside, Cillian yelled, grabbing my arm and pulling me toward the heavy oak doors. We barely slammed the doors and dropped the iron bolt before the first impact hit. The entire palace shuddered. The wood groaned, and the sound of claws, or whatever those things had, scraping against the stone sounded like 1,000 knives on a chalkboard. The doors won't hold, I said, looking around the empty great hall. The overturned tables and spilled wine looked like relics from a different era. They're made of matter, those things. They're made of the shift itself. Then we go higher, Cillian said. If we can get to the solar, we can see where the pack went. They can't all be frozen, Thora. There has to be a group that survived the pulse. We sprinted up the grand staircase, the sounds of the creatures echoing through the hollow halls. It was like being hunted by ghosts. Every time I looked over my shoulder, I saw a flicker of silver light passing through a wall or a floor. They weren't breaking the palace. They were phased into it. We reached the King's Solar, a high circular room with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the entire territory. Cillian slammed the door and shoved a heavy oak desk against it, though we both knew it was a gesture of hope rather than a real barrier. I ran to the window. From this height, the silver desert looked even more vast. But now I saw it, a movement near the Cage River. There, I pointed. A group is moving. They're not frozen. Cillian leaned over my shoulder. His heat was the only thing keeping the chill of the red moon at bay. That's the south. I recognized Kael's banner. They're heading for the ancient cairns in the valley. The cairns are built from the same obsidian as the vault, I realized. They're shielded. Kael must have known this was coming. He didn't come for the throne. He came because he knew the world was ending and he wanted the only safe ground left. And Isolde? Cillian asked, his jaw tight. I scanned the dunes. Near the wreckage of the guard tower, I saw a flash of white fur. She's with Soren. They're pinned down. The Voidwalkers are circling them. Cillian looked at the window, then at me. His gray eyes were filled with a terrible conflict. They tried to kill you, Thora. They tried to steal our home. I know, I said, my voice steady. But if they die, the North dies with them. And right now, we need every wolf alive if we're going to survive the night. You're a better queen than I am a king, Cillian said, a small, sad smile touching his lips. He reached out and tucked a stray lock of hair behind my ear, his fingers lingering on the scar on my jaw. I spent 10 years wanting to burn the North to the ground for what they did to you. Now you're the one telling me to save them. I'm not saving them for their sake, I said, leaning into his touch. I'm saving them so I can be the one to exile them properly once the sun comes up. Cillian laughed, a short, dark sound, spoken like a true kingslayer. The door to the solar exploded inward. The oak desk was thrown across the room like a toy. One of the Voidwalkers stood in the doorway, its form flickering violently. It was a mass of silver static and elongated bone. It lunged, Not for Cillian, but for me. Cillian didn't hesitate. He shifted midair, his transformation a blur of black fur and muscle. He intercepted the creature, his jaws closing around its shimmering neck. But there was no resistance. His teeth passed right through the silver mist as if he were biting the air. The creature's hand slammed into Cillian's chest, throwing him across the room and through the glass window. "Cillian," I screamed. The sound of shattering glass felt like my heart breaking. I ran to the jagged opening. Cillian was clinging to a stone ledge 40 feet above the silver sand, his claws scraping for purchase. Below him, 3 more voidwalkers were waiting, their maws open. The creature in the room turned toward me, its electronic shriek vibrating in my chest. I didn't have a weapon that could hurt a ghost. I didn't have an army, all I had was the blood in my veins, the liquid silver that was currently pulsing in time with the red moon. If I am the frequency, I thought, then I am the master of the static. I didn't run, I walked toward the voidwalker. I reached out my hand, palm open, showing the fresh cut I'd made in the great hall. The silver blood was still wet, glowing with an intense internal light. The creature paused. It tilted its head, its bone jaw clicking. "You want this?" I whispered, my voice echoing with a power that wasn't mine. "Come and take it." I called the silver. I didn't push it. I pulled it from the air around me. The silver sand from the desert outside began to swirl, hard drawn into the room through the broken window. It formed a localized cyclone, a shimmering vortex of crushed memory and primal energy. The voidwalker tried to shriek, but the sound was drowned out by the roar of the sand. I thrust my hand into the center of the creature's flickering chest and released the pulse. The explosion wasn't loud. It was a vacuum of sound. The voidwalker didn't die. It simply dissolved into the silver sand, its form incorporated into the vortex I'd created. I felt a surge of power so immense it nearly buckled my knees. For a second, I could see everything: the frozen wolves, the red moon, the fear in Kyle's heart, the agony in Isolde's soul. I was the web, and they were the flies. But I saw Cillian's fingers slipping from the ledge. I broke the connection. The silver sand fell to the floor in a dead heap. I scrambled to the window and reached down. "Cillian, take my hand." He looked up, his wolf eyes wide with terror. Not of the fall, but of me. He had seen what I just did. He had seen the way my eyes had turned into solid silver coins. For a heartbeat, he hesitated. He didn't recognize the woman looking down at him. "Cillian, please," I sobbed. The Rhea in me screaming to be seen. "It's me, it's Thora." His fingers slipped another inch. The voidwalkers below were leaping, their translucent bodies stretching upward. Cillian lunged. I caught his hand, the impact nearly pulling me out of the window with him. I groaned, my muscles screaming, the silver in my blood burning like acid. With a strength that was purely supernatural, I hauled him back over the ledge and onto the solar floor. He shifted back to human immediately, gasping for air, his skin cold as ice. He didn't pull me into his arms. He backed away, staring at my hands, which were still glowing with a faint silver light. "What was that?" he whispered. "Thora? What are you becoming?" "I'm becoming what I need to be to keep you alive," I said, my voice trembling. "Do you think I wanted this? I wanted a cottage in the south and a life where the only thing I had to worry about was the winter frost. But they burned that girl, Cillian. This is what's left." I walked toward him, but he didn't move. He just watched me. "We have to go," I said, hardening my heart. "The cairns. If we can reach Kyle, we can use the obsidian to shield the rest of the pack before the red moon reaches its zenith. If we don't, they'll never wake up. They'll just be statues in a silver desert forever." "And the voidwalkers?" Cillian asked. "Yes, I can hold them off," I said, "but only for a while. Every time I use the power, I lose a piece of the girl you remember." Cillian finally stepped forward. He took my glowing hands in his and kissed the palms, ignoring the way the silver light seared his lips. "Then we'll find those pieces together," he vowed. "Even if I have to sift through every grain of sand in this desert to find them." We left the palace through the secret tunnels, emerging into the silver waste. The air was silent again, the red moon now directly overhead. It was so large it took up half the sky, the craters on its surface looking like weeping sores. The trek to the cairns was a journey through a graveyard. We passed wolves we knew, the baker, the head of the guard, the old woman who used to tell us stories. They were all frozen in mid-stride, in their fur coated in a fine layer of silver dust. As we neared the valley, the sound of fighting reached us. Kyle's warriors were standing in a circle around the largest obsidian cairn, fighting off a literal wave of voidwalkers. They were losing. Their weapons passed through the creatures, and for every warrior that fell, another voidwalker seemed to materialize from the silver sand. Look, Cillian pointed. Isolde and Soren were backed against a smaller cairn, a few yards away from Kale's group. Soren was in his white wolf form, his flank bleeding silver ichor, his breath coming in ragged, wet gasps. Isolde was standing over him with a broken spear, her face a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. They won't make it, Cillian said, his muscles tensing. I looked at the red moon. I could feel it pulling at me, inviting me to just let go. To become the silver storm and wipe everything clean. It would be so easy. I could end the war, the hunger, and the fear in a single breath. But I looked at Cillian. I looked at the way he was ready to run into a certain death to save his enemies, because that's what a king does. Go to Kyle, I commanded. Tell him to open the cairn. Tell him if he doesn't, I'll bury him in it. What are you going to do? I didn't answer. I walked into the center of the battlefield. The voidwalkers stopped. They turned as one, their bone jaws clicking in a horrific synchronized rhythm. They recognized me. I was their queen, and I was their prey. I knelt on the silver sand and pressed both palms into the ground. By the blood of the shadow, I whispered, the words echoing with the force of a landslide. By the soul of the moon. I reject the void. I didn't just call the silver this time, I gave it. I pushed every ounce of the primal energy in my body into the ground. A shockwave of solid silver light erupted from me, rippling across the valley like a tidal wave. The voidwalkers didn't just dissolve, they shattered. The high-pitched shrieks were deafening as the creatures were torn apart, their essence dragged down into the silver sand. The shockwave hit the cairns, the obsidian absorbing the impact and glowing with a deep, dark purple light. And then, the wolves began to wake up. Around the valley and back at the palace, the frozen statues began to cough. They began to blink. The silver dust fell from their fur as they collapsed to their knees, gasping for air. I slumped forward, my vision fading to black. I felt Cillian's arms catch me. I felt his tears on my neck. Thora, stay with me, Thora! I tried to speak, to tell him that I was still there, but my voice was gone. Not the mute silence from before, but a hollow, empty void where my soul used to be. I looked up at the red moon. It wasn't a moon anymore, it was an eye, and it was looking directly at me. From the largest cairn, Kale stepped out. He wasn't looking at the waking wolves. He wasn't looking at the retreating shadows. He was looking at the silver sand at my feet, which was beginning to form words. The price has been paid, Kale whispered, his voice full of a dark, terrifying glee. I looked down at the sand. One for the throne, one for the grave, one for the moon. I looked at Cillian, then at the old king, who was suddenly standing at the edge of the valley, and his human form flickering like a candle in the wind. He wasn't a ghost. He was a messenger. The hunt has officially begun, Thora, the old king said. And you're not the hunter anymore. Behind him, the horizon didn't just glow, it opened. A massive black wolf, easily the size of a mountain, stepped out of the sky itself. Its eyes were the same red as the moon, and its paws left footprints of fire on the silver sand. The Fenris, the end of the world, and it was looking at Cillian. Chapter 6. The Eye of the Fenris. The scale of the beast was an insult to reality. It didn't just stand on the horizon, it claimed the horizon. The Fenris was a mountain of obsidian fur, an ancient celestial hunger, its breath a cold wind that smelled of dying stars and wet earth. Every time its massive fiery paws touched the silver sand, the desert hissed, the grains turning into black glass instantly. It didn't growl, it didn't need to. The sheer weight of its presence was a sound that vibrated in my marrow, a low-frequency hum that told every living thing in the valley that its time was up. And those red eyes, they weren't just looking at Cillian, they were judging him. Get back, Cillian whispered, his voice sounding like a fragile glass thread against the roar of the wind. He stepped in front of me, his body trembling with a mixture of terror and an alpha's instinctual defiance. Thora, get to the cairn, now. I didn't move, I couldn't. The silver in my blood was no longer just a power, it was a tether. I could feel the Fenris in my mind, a dark, vast consciousness that felt like falling into a well. It didn't see me as a queen or a kingslayer. As it saw me as a leak, A hole in the dam that needed to be plugged. It's not here for the pack, I said. The words feeling like shards of ice in my throat. It's here for the bloodline. It's here to reset the scale. From the largest cairn, Kel let out a sharp, jagged laugh. He was clutching the side of the obsidian stone, his eyes wide with a manic, religious fervor. The Great Devourer. The prophecy wasn't a warning, you fools. It was an invitation. The silver blood calls the shadow, and the shadow calls the end. Shut up, Kyle, Cillian roared. But his voice was swallowed by a sudden, ear-splitting crack. The Fenris moved. It didn't run. It simply was there. One moment it was a mile away, and the next, its shadow fell over the valley like a curtain. The air grew so cold, my breath froze into crystals before it even left my lips. The massive head descended, the snout alone the size of the cage throne room. It sniffed the air, and the force of the inhalation nearly pulled me off my feet. The beast's gaze settled on Cillian. A low, vibrating rumble, a sound that was almost a word, erupted from its throat. Alpha. I am the king of the cage, Cillian said, his voice finding a strange, steady iron. He stood his ground, a tiny speck of black leather in defiance against the colossal predator. If you want the soul of this pack, you have to go through me. The Fenris tilted its head. Then it exhaled. A wave of black fire, not heat but a terrifying, soul-chilling cold, swept over the valley. It wasn't meant to burn the flesh. It was meant to strip the shift. I saw the warriors around us collapse as their wolves were forcibly shoved back into the dark corners of their minds. Soren, still in his white wolf form, let out a pathetic whimper and shrank back into his human shape, shivering and naked in the silver sand. Cillian took the hit full force. He didn't collapse, but he fell to one knee, his skin turning a sickly, translucent gray. He was fighting to keep his wolf, fighting to stay conscious as the Fenris tried to hollow him out. Stop it, I screamed. I didn't think. I didn't plan. I ran into the path of the black fire. The cold hit me like a physical wall, but the silver in my veins flared to life. It met the black fire and pushed back. I felt my skin begin to glow, a brilliant metallic radiance that cut through the darkness of the beast's shadow. I was a candle in a hurricane, but I was burning. The Fenris shifted its gaze to me. The red eyes narrowed, the pupils like vertical slits of molten lava. At Kingslayer, the voice boomed in my head, cold and ancient. You broke the seal. You released the frequency. You have invited the hunger. Now, you must feed it. I won't let you take him, I gasped, my knees buckling under the pressure. Take the silver, take the power, just leave the pack alone. The beast leaned in closer, its teeth, each one a jagged pillar of black crystal, inches from my face. The silver is a debt, it rumbled. And debts are paid in souls, one for the throne, one for the grave, one for the moon. Choose, Shadow. Or I choose for you. The Fenris's massive paw raised, hovering over the cairn where the survivors were hiding. If it dropped, it wouldn't just crush the stone, it would erase the lives within it. Thora, don't, Cillian yelled, trying to crawl toward me. Don't listen to it. We'll find another way. There is no other way, Cillian, I cried out. The silver light from my skin starting to crack, leaking from my pores like molten metal. The world is already broken. I'm just trying to keep the pieces together. I looked at the Fenris. I looked at the red moon. And then, I looked at the silver ring in my pocket, the signet of the Kingslayers. To my shadow, may the moon never find you. I realized then that the motto wasn't a blessing. It was a tactical instruction. The moon, the red moon, was the eye of the Fenris. As long as it could see us, it could command us. You want a soul? I whispered, my voice echoing with a dark, silver resonance. Then take the one that started this. I didn't point at Cillian. I didn't point at myself. I pointed at the old king, who was still standing at the edge of the dunes, at his form flickering like a dying holographic projection. He wasn't a man anymore. He was a ghost of a sin, a lingering vibration of the greed that had tried to steal the silver 10 years ago. He is the source, I told the beast. He is the one who tried to bridge the worlds. He is the one who broke the laws of the shift. Take him back to the dark. The Fenris turned its massive head toward the old king. The ghost of the king didn't flee. He simply stood there, a sad, empty smile on his face. He knew his time was up. He'd been a ghost for a decade. He was just waiting for a reaper big enough to notice him. The Fenris opened its maw and inhaled. The old king didn't scream. He simply dissolved into a cloud of gray ash, drawn into the black vortex of the beast's throat. For a second, the pressure in the valley eased. As the black fire dissipated, The Fenris lowered its paw, but the red moon didn't change. It grew brighter. One for the grave is paid, the Fenris rumbled. Now, one for the throne. It looked back at Cillian. The throne is empty, Cillian gasped, standing up and wiping the gray frost from his face. The cage is gone. There is no king here. There is always a king, the Fenris countered. And a king must fall so the pack can rise. Suddenly, Kale stepped out from the shadows of the cairn. He wasn't looking at the beast with fear anymore. He was holding a jagged piece of obsidian, a shard from the broken vault door. He's right, Kyle whispered, his voice dripping with venom. A king must fall, but it doesn't have to be Cillian. Before anyone could react, Kyle lunged. He didn't go for Cillian. He went for me. For if the Kingslayer dies, Kyle shrieked, the frequency resets. The world goes back to the way it was. No more silver, no more monsters, just the power of the South. The obsidian blade moved in a blur. I was too weak from the silver flare to dodge. I saw the dark edge coming for my heart, and I saw Cillian's eyes widen in a slow-motion scream of horror. But the blade never hit me. A white blur slammed into Kyle, knocking him into the silver sand. It was Soren. The Northern King had recovered enough of his strength to move. He pinned Kyle to the ground, his fingers digging into the Southern Beta's throat. You think you're the only one who wants the world back, Kyle? Soren growled, his voice a ragged mess. But I won't let a coward like you steal the kill. Soren looked up at the Fenris, then at me, and there was a look in his eyes I'd never seen before. A strange, desperate honor. The North doesn't bow, Soren said, his voice echoing. But we recognize a true queen when she's standing in the middle of a nightmare. Thora, end this. Even if you have to burn us all to do it. Soren raised the obsidian shard he'd wrestled away from Kyle. But he didn't use it on Kyle. He plunged it into his own chest. A king falls, Soren roared, his blood hitting the silver sand and turning it into a boiling black steam. The debt is paid, one for the throne. The Fenris let out a sound that was half howl, half shudder. The red moon began to flicker. The massive beast began to dissolve at the edges, its obsidian fur turning into the same silver mist as the Voidwalkers. The debt is acknowledged, the Fenris rumbled, its voice fading into the wind. One for the grave, one for the throne, but the moon? The moon still hungers. The beast vanished. The pressure vanished. The valley was suddenly, terrifyingly quiet. Soren lay in the sand, his eyes fixed on the sky, his life fading into the silver. Kyle scrambled away into the darkness, his plan in ruins. The survivors began to crawl out of the cairns, looking around at a world that was still wrong, still silver, but no longer being actively hunted. Cillian ran to me, catching me as I collapsed. My skin was cold, the silver light finally dying down to a dull, gray flicker. Thora, talk to me. I looked up at him, but my vision was failing. The red moon was the only thing I could see. It was pulsing faster now, a frantic, desperate rhythm. The third price, I whispered. One for the moon. No, Cillian said, his voice breaking. No more prices, we're done. The beast is gone. It's not gone, I said, pointing a trembling finger at the sky. It just moved. As I spoke, the red moon began to crack. It didn't shatter like the crown, it opened like an egg. And from within the moon, something began to descend. It wasn't a wolf, it wasn't a monster. It was a girl. She looked exactly like I did before the fire. Same hair, same eyes, same smile. But she was made of pure, liquid silver. She floated down from the sky, her feet touching the sand with a sound like a chime. She walked toward us, the survivors parting for her like the sea. She stopped in front of me and Cillian. She didn't look at Cillian. She looked at me. You did well, Shadow, the girl said, her voice sounding like my own, but echoed 1,000 times. You broke the world so I could be born. But now, sure, there isn't enough room for both of us. She reached out a silver hand and touched the scar on my jaw. I am the Luna the pack was promised, she whispered. I am the perfection without the ash. I am the fated mate Cillian deserves. She looked at Cillian then, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I saw Cillian's eyes change. The gray didn't turn to amber, it turned to silver. Cillian, I whispered, my heart freezing in my chest. He didn't look at me. He was staring at the silver girl, his hand slowly letting go of mine. He looked like a man in a trance, a man seeing a dream come to life. Thora, he breathed, reaching out for the silver girl. The girl smiled, a perfect, cruel, beautiful smile. She took his hand and looked back at me. The third price is paid, Shadow, she said. The moon has found you. Suddenly, the silver sand beneath my feet turned into liquid. I didn't fall. I was pulled. I began to sink into the desert, the cold metallic grains filling my mouth, my nose, my eyes. I looked up one last time. I saw Cillian walking away into the silver light. His arm around the perfect, unscarred version of me. He didn't look back. The sand closed over my head. The last thing I heard wasn't a howl. It was the sound of a wedding march. Chapter 7. The Undersand. Suffocation isn't the panic they tell you about in the stories. When the silver sand claimed me, it didn't feel like drowning in water. It felt like being buried in a mountain of frozen static. The grains filled my ears, my mouth, and finally, my eyes. Until the image of Cillian walking away with that shimmering, unscarred ghost was burned into my retinas as a final, cruel parting gift. I didn't scream. You can't scream when your lungs are packed with metallic dust. I just sank. I expected the end. I expected a cold, quiet grave beneath the dunes of the world I'd broken. But as the weight of the desert pressed in on me, the silver in my blood didn't just sit there. It roared. My veins turned into white-hot wires, and instead of the crushing pressure of earth, I felt a sudden, violent release. I fell. I hit a surface that felt like polished glass, the air returning to my lungs in a ragged, agonizing gasp. I coughed, hacking up silver grit that sparkled on the floor like spilled diamonds. My body was a roadmap of bruises and betrayal, but I was breathing. I sat up, my hands trembling as I wiped the grit from my face. I wasn't in the desert anymore. I was nowhere. The space was an infinite, dark cathedral of obsidian. Above me there was no red moon, only a ceiling of shifting, liquid silver that pulsed like a heartbeat. This was the undersand, the reverse of the world above. Every grain of sand in the desert was a reflection of a memory, and I was sitting at the roots of it all. So the shadow finally falls, a voice echoed. I spun around, my hand going to my empty sash. I'd lost my knife, I'd lost my pack, I'd lost my king. But the fierce girl within me, the one they tried to burn out, was still baring her teeth. Standing a few yards away was a woman. She was old, her skin like wrinkled parchment, her hair a wild mane of white that drifted in the air as if she were underwater. She wore a dress made of woven shadows, and in her hand, she held a spindle that was spinning threads of pure, liquid light. "Who are you?" I rasped, my voice sounding more like the girl in the ash than the queen on the throne. "I am the weaver of the wastes," she said, her eyes, two solid spheres of silver, fixing on me. "I am what happens to the Lunas who are forgotten. I am the silence that follows the howl." She stopped her spindle and looked at the liquid ceiling above us. "The girl you saw above, she is not a ghost, Thora. She is the perfect version. She is every dream Cillian ever had of you, stripped of the pain, the scars, and the messy, inconvenient truth of your survival. The Fenris didn't just take a soul. It took your place." He looked at her, I whispered, the memory feeling like a fresh blade in my gut. He let go of my hand. He didn't even look back. "Of course he didn't," the weaver cackled, a sound like dry bones clicking. "The silver moon doesn't just glow. It enchants. He sees what he wants to see. He sees the Thora he didn't have to fail. He sees the girl who didn't spend 10 years scrubbing floors and planning revenge. He sees a lie, and he loves it because the truth is too heavy to carry." I stood up, my knees shaking, but my head held high. "He's my mate. The bond is a frequency, child, and she is broadcasting on every channel he has. To him, you are just a memory of ash. To him, she is the soul." The weaver stepped closer, her shadow stretching out across the obsidian floor. "You have two choices, Shadow. You can stay here and fade into the static, becoming another thread in my spindle. Or you can climb back up and reclaim a throne that no longer wants you, to a man who has forgotten your name. How do I climb back?" The weaver pointed to a massive, jagged pillar of obsidian that rose from the center of the dark hall, piercing the liquid ceiling. "That is the spine of the world," she said, "but be warned. Every step you take up that stone will cost you a memory. To reach the top, you must shed the weight of who you were. By the time you reach the surface, you may not remember why you wanted to go back at all." I looked at the pillar. It looked like a staircase made of knives. "I've spent 10 years remembering," I said, my voice hardening. "Maybe it's time I started forgetting." I walked to the pillar and placed my hand on the cold stone. The first step was a jolt of electricity. I saw a flash of the fire, the smell of the smoke, the heat on my face. It vanished. The pain in my jaw dulled. I took another step. I saw Cillian at age 7, handing me a wilted wildflower. It vanished. And the warmth in my chest turned to lead. Step after step, I climbed. I felt my past peeling away like old skin. I forgot the names of the kitchen maids. I forgot the taste of the southern wine. I forgot the exact shade of the old king's yellow eyes. I was becoming a hollow thing, a vessel of silver and rage. Halfway up the pillar, the obsidian began to hum. The liquid ceiling above me started to churn, and I heard the sound of the wedding march again. It was muffled, coming from the world above, but it was clear enough to make my blood boil. One for the throne, one for the grave, one for the moon. I realized then that the perfect Thora wasn't just a replacement, she was a siphon. She was using Cillian's devotion to anchor the Fenris's power to the world of the living. As long as he loved the lie, the red moon would never set. I climbed faster, my fingers bleeding as I gripped the jagged edges of the stone. I was losing myself, grain by grain. I forgot the fire, I forgot the scar. I even forgot the feeling of the silver sand beneath my feet. All that remained was a single, burning image. Cillian's hand letting go of mine. That was the anchor. That was the one memory I refused to let the stone take. I reached the top of the pillar. The liquid silver ceiling was inches from my face. It wasn't a solid barrier. It was a membrane. I reached out and punched through. I didn't emerge into the desert. I emerged into the great hall of the Cage Palace. But it wasn't the ruined hall I'd left. It was pristine. The chandeliers were lit with a soft silver light. The tapestries were whole. The tables were laden with food that smelled of honey and rosemary. Oh, and at the end of the hall, Cillian stood before a throne made of solid moonlight. He was wearing his royal robes, but they were silver now, woven from the same light as the desert. Beside him stood the other Thora. She was wearing a gown of liquid stars, her face radiant and perfect. The hall was full of wolves, my pack, the northern wolves, the southern warriors. They were all there, dressed in their finest, their eyes glowing with a dull silver light. They weren't fighting, they weren't afraid, they were smiling. It was a nightmare of peace. I stepped onto the floor, my rags dripping with black obsidian silt. I looked like a smudge on a masterpiece. Stop the ceremony, I tried to say, but the words were a rasp. My voice was failing again. No one looked at me. It was as if I truly were a ghost. I walked down the center aisle, my boots leaving muddy prints on the white silk carpet. I reached the front of the hall. Cillian was looking at the silver girl with a devotion so pure, it made my stomach turn. He was about to place a crown of silver leaves on her head. "Cillian," I said, louder this time. He paused. He didn't turn around, but his shoulders tensed. The silver girl's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. "Cillian, look at me." He slowly turned his head. His eyes were the color of the silver desert, blank, beautiful, and empty. He looked at me and I saw the moment of recognition struggle against the enchantment. He saw the scars. He saw the mud. He saw the truth. And he looked away. "Guards," he said, his voice as cold as the undersand. "Remove this shadow from the hall, and it is a remnant of a world that no longer exists." 2 guards, men I had grown up with, stepped forward. They didn't look at me with hate. They looked at me with pity. They grabbed my arms, their grip firm. "Cillian, it's a lie," I shouted, struggling against them. "She's the Fenris. She's the eye in the sky. If you crown her, the moon will never set. The pack will never truly wake up." The silver girl stepped forward. She didn't look angry. She looked sad. "Poor shadow," she said, her voice like a lullaby. "You clung to the pain for so long that you think it's the only thing that's real. But Cillian is tired of pain. The pack is tired of war. We have brought them peace. We have brought them the Silver Age." She looked at Cillian and touched his cheek. "Do you want to go back to the ash, Cillian? Do you want to go back to the girl who only reminds you of your failures?" Cillian looked at her, and the silver in his eyes deepened. "No," he whispered. "I want the light." "Then finish it," she urged. Cillian raised the crown. I felt the silver in my blood reach its breaking point. If I didn't act now, the Weaver's warning would come true. I would fade. I would become a thread. I didn't try to break free of the guards. I did the opposite. I relaxed. I let the silver in me drop, not into the ground, but into the floorboards of the palace itself. I called on the one memory I had left, the feeling of his hand leaving mine. I didn't use power. I used the pain. I let out a howl. It wasn't the sound of a wolf. It was the sound of a soul being torn apart. The sound shattered the silver chandeliers. And the silk carpet beneath my feet began to blacken and curl. The piece of the room began to fracture like a broken mirror. Cillian flinched, the crown slipping from his fingers. The silver girl let out a hiss, her form flickering for a second, revealing the jagged skeletal bone beneath her beautiful skin. "The light is a cage," I screamed, my voice finally finding its edge. "And a king who hides in a cage isn't a king, he's a trophy." The guards let go of me, clutching their heads as the frequency of my howl vibrated through the room. I ran toward the throne. I didn't go for the girl, I went for Cillian. I grabbed his face with my mud-stained, bleeding hands. I forced him to look at me, not at the perfect Thora, but at the girl with the scar. The girl who had survived the fire he'd failed to stop. "Look at me, Cillian Kedge," I roared. "I remember the ash, remember the blood, remember the girl who didn't let you die in the vault." His eyes searched mine. I saw the silver clouds in his pupils begin to swirl, to break apart. I saw a flash of gray, the real warm gray of the man who had kissed my palms in the solar. "Thora," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Don't listen to her," the silver girl shrieked. She wasn't beautiful anymore. Her skin was peeling away in shimmering flakes, revealing the black void beneath. "She is the shadow. She is the one who broke the world." She lunged for us, her fingers turning into silver talons. Cillian didn't flinch. He didn't look at her. He kept his eyes on mine. "You're real," he breathed, his hand coming up to touch the scar on my jaw. "The pain? It's real." "It's the only thing that is," I said. Cillian stood up, and his royal robes shedding their silver light and turning back into the tattered, blood-stained leather of a warrior. He looked at the silver girl, his eyes finally clearing. "You are a masterpiece," Cillian said to the entity. "But my mate is a survivor, and I'd rather bleed with her than dream with you." The silver girl let out a shriek that sounded like 1,000 dying stars. The perfect palace around us began to dissolve. The tapestries turned back to ash, the food to dust, and the silver light to a cold, oppressive darkness. We were back in the ruins of the Great Hall. The red moon was still in the sky, but it was closer now, taking up almost the entire horizon. And it was screaming. The entities, the void walkers, began to pour through the windows, drawn by the silver girl's death shriek. But they weren't attacking. And they were merging. The silver girl didn't die. She expanded. She became a swirling vortex of silver static and black bone, growing until she touched the ceiling. "If I cannot be your queen," the entity boomed, "then I will be your grave." The floor beneath us gave way again, but we weren't falling into the undersand this time. We were being pulled up. The red moon was acting like a giant magnet, dragging the palace, the pack, and the very earth itself into the sky. Cillian and I were lifted off our feet, floating in the center of the great hall as the walls crumbled around us. We were being drawn toward the center of the red moon, the eye of the Fenris. "Cillian," I shouted, reaching for him in the weightless chaos. We grabbed each other, our fingers interlocking. We were flying toward the red abyss, surrounded by the debris of our life. And then, from the center of the moon, a voice spoke. It wasn't the Fenris, it wasn't the Weaver, it was my mother. "Thora," the voice whispered, sounding like the wind through the pines. "The ring, the signet. It's not a key for a door." I looked at the silver ring on my finger. It was glowing with a blinding white light. "Then what is it?" I cried out. "It's a needle," the voice said. "And you are the thread. Stitch the world back together, my shadow, or let it unravel." The red moon opened its mouth. We were inches away from the event horizon. I looked at Cillian. He looked at me. "Whatever happens," he said, "don't let go." "Never," I promised. I took the silver ring and slammed it into the center of the silver girl's vortex. The world didn't explode. It folded. Chapter 8. The Silver Stitch. At the folding of the world felt like being crushed between two mirrors. One moment, Cillian and I were weightless, drifting into the scarlet maw of the moon. The next, the dimensions themselves seemed to buckle. Reality didn't just break, it creaked, like the hull of a ship under too much pressure. The Great Hall, the Silver Desert, and the Red Abyss all flattened into a single terrifying plane of existence. The signet ring, the needle, was buried deep in the chest of the silver entity, and the light it emitted was no longer white. It was a blinding, iridescent spectrum that seared my vision. "Thora, hold on," Cillian's voice sounded like it was coming from 1,000 miles away, though his fingers were still crushed against mine. "I'm not letting go," I screamed back. But I wasn't just holding his hand anymore. That I was holding the fabric of existence. The silver girl, the perfect version, didn't just shriek. She unraveled. Her liquid skin became long, shimmering ribbons of light that stretched out toward the edges of the horizon. These were the threads my mother's voice had spoken of. They were the raw data of our lives, the memories and possibilities that the Fenris had tried to digest. Stitch the world, the wind whispered, or let it unravel. I realized then that I was the anchor. My body, my scars, my pain. It was the only thing in this hall that was heavy enough to remain grounded. I planted my feet on the crumbling stone of the throne dais, the silver ribbons whipping around me like a cyclone. I reached out with my free hand, grabbing one of the ribbons. It felt like a live wire. Images flashed through my mind, the smell of the first snow, at the sound of a pup's first howl, the taste of stale bread in the ashes. It was a fragment of the pack's history. I pulled. I took the ribbon and looped it through the obsidian pillars of the hall. Then I grabbed another, the scent of rain, the feeling of a mate's touch, and pulled that too. I was weaving, my fingers moving with a frantic, desperate grace. I was using the signet ring as the guide, stitching the ribbons of the perfect lie back into the ragged edges of our real, broken world. "Cillian, help me," I gasped, the effort draining the very life from my marrow. "I can't hold it all." Cillian didn't hesitate. He saw what I was doing. He grabbed a ribbon of light that was vibrating with the frequency of the northern mountains and anchored it to the base of the throne. Together, we were a pair of cosmic seamstresses, unworking in a hurricane of our own making. The entity, the void beneath the girl's skin, fought back. It lunged at us with skeletal claws made of black shadow. "You would choose the rot?" the entity boomed, its voice a discordance of static. "You would choose the scar over the star? You would choose a world that burns?" "Every single time," Cillian roared. He intercepted a shadow claw with his bare hands, his skin sizzling as the void touched him. He didn't pull away. He used the contact to channel his own alpha frequency into the void, disrupting its form. I pushed the signet ring deeper into the center of the vortex. The silver ribbons began to tighten. The red moon in the sky started to contract, its massive eye blinking in sudden, agonizing pain. We weren't just fixing the palace, we were pulling the world back down. The silver sand outside began to turn back into soil. The blood-red moon began to fade into the pale, gray light of a dawn that was 10 years overdue. "It's working," I breathed, my vision blurring. "Cillian, look, the trees." Below the palace, the silver dunes were receding, and the gnarled, ancient roots of the cage forest were clawing their way back to the surface. The frozen wolves were collapsing, no longer statues, but living, breathing beings again. But the price was still being tallied. The silver ribbons were pulling tight around me, binding me to the throne. The more I stitched, the more I became part of the weave. My skin was starting to shimmer with that same translucent light. I was becoming the very thing I was trying to defeat. "Thora, stop!" Cillian shouted, seeing the light crawling up my arms. You're fading." "I have to finish it, Cillian. If I stop now, the tear will just open again." "Not like this. I didn't get you back just to lose you to the sky." He lunged for the signet ring, trying to pull it out of the weave, but a bolt of silver energy threw him back. The frequency was too high. It was a Kingslayer's burden, and he was a king. We were two halves of a whole that weren't meant to touch this power together. The silver girl's face reappeared in the center of the vortex, but she was distorted now, half bone and half light. "If you finish the stitch, Shadow," she hissed, "you go with it. You will be the thread that holds the world together, but you will never walk upon it again." Is he worth an eternity of silence? I looked at Cillian. He was on the floor, struggling to stand, his eyes full of a desperate, pleading love. And he was the boy who had climbed trees for me. He was the man who had kissed my scars. He was the reason I had survived the fire. "He's worth everything," I said. I took the final ribbon, the one that pulsed with the light of the true moon, and prepared to tie the knot. Suddenly, a shadow fell over us. Not the shadow of the Fenris, but a human one. Xander. He had crawled from the rubble of the sublevels, his face a mask of blood and obsidian dust. He looked at the weave, then at me. "The weaver told me you'd try to be the hero," Xander rasped, his voice sounding like grinding stones. "She told me you'd try to take the burden, but you're too important, Thora. The pack needs a Luna who can bleed. They don't need another ghost." Before I could stop him, Xander lunged at the vortex. He didn't try to pull the ring out. But he grabbed the ribbons I was holding. "Xander, no, you can't handle the frequency." "I was the one who helped him start the fire," Xander said, his eyes finally finding mine with a terrifying, peaceful clarity. "I was the one who stayed in the palace while you were in the ash. it's my turn to stay in the dark." He shoved me away with a strength fueled by the final desperate shift of a dying wolf. I fell back into Cillian's arms as Xander wrapped the silver ribbons around his own torso. The light hit him, and he didn't scream. He began to glow, his body becoming a conduit for the energy. He took the signet ring from my hand and pressed it into his own chest. "Go," Xander whispered. "Be the king and queen of the ruins. It's all we ever deserved." The vortex imploded. A wave of white light washed over the great hall. It's so bright it felt like the sun had been born in the room. I felt Cillian's arms wrap around me, shielding me from the blast. And then, silence. When I opened my eyes, the great hall was still a ruin, but the silver was gone. The red moon was a pale, fading memory in a sky that was turning a beautiful, soft blue. The silver desert had vanished, replaced by the damp, dark earth of the cage territory. Xander was gone. The throne was gone. Cillian and I lay on the stone floor, covered in dust and ash, but we were alive, we were human, and we were together. I looked at my hand. The scar on my jaw was still there, but the silver ring was gone. I felt light. The heavy metallic hum in my blood had quieted to a gentle, natural thrum. "Is it over?" Cillian asked, his voice shaking as he pulled me close. "I think so," I whispered. We stood up, leaning on each other. Outside, the pack was starting to wake. I could hear the sounds of life returning to the forest, the rustle of leaves, the call of a bird, the distant howl of a scout. But as we walked toward the balcony to look out over our kingdom, I felt a sudden, sharp pain in my chest. I looked down. A small silver thread was growing out of my skin, right over my heart. It was vibrating. And from the forest below, a new sound emerged. It wasn't a wolf. It wasn't a monster. It was a heartbeat. A massive rhythmic thumping that seemed to be coming from the very earth itself. Thump, 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 thump. The silver thread in my chest pulsed in perfect time with it. "Cillian," I said, my voice trembling, "I don't think Xander finished the stitch." I looked out at the horizon. The trees were back, but they weren't right. And their leaves were silver. The river wasn't water, it was liquid moonlight. We hadn't fixed the world, we had merged it. And then the sound of the heartbeat stopped. A voice boomed from the air itself, a voice I had heard once before, in the vault of the old king. "The stitches held shadow, but the weaver wants her thread back." From the shadows of the hall, the weaver herself stepped out. She wasn't an old woman anymore. She was a towering figure of black obsidian, her eyes like twin stars. "A soul for a soul, Thora," she said. "Xander was a noble sacrifice, but he didn't have the silver. You do." She raised her hand, and the silver thread in my chest began to pull. I felt myself being dragged toward her, my feet sliding across the stone. "No," Cillian roared, shifting into his black wolf form in a blur of fur and muscle. He lunged for the weaver, but she simply waved her hand, and he was frozen midair, held in a cage of silver light. "The world is stitched, child," the weaver said, looking at me. "But you are the only thing holding the knot. If you want to stay here, the world will unravel again. If you come with me, the pack lives in the Silver Age." She leaned in, her cold stone face inches from mine. "Choose quickly, Shadow. The moon is waiting." I looked at Cillian, frozen in his cage of light. I looked at the silver forest, beautiful and wrong. And then, I looked at the weaver's spindle. It was empty. "I won't go with you," I said, my voice hardening, "but I will give you what you want." I reached into my own chest, my fingers closing around the silver thread. I didn't pull it out. I pushed it. I pushed the thread into Cillian. And the light exploded again, but this time it wasn't white. It was black and silver, the colors of our combined souls. The weaver let out a shriek of rage as the connection was broken. The cage of light shattered, and Cillian hit the floor, his eyes glowing with a new, terrifying power. He wasn't just a king anymore. He was the weaver's successor. "The throne is occupied," Cillian said, his voice echoing with 1,000 years of authority. The weaver didn't fight. She bowed. "The king of the wastes," she whispered, her obsidian form beginning to crumble. "The shadow has found its light." She vanished into a cloud of silver dust. Cillian stood up, his body radiating a calm, terrifying power. He looked at me, and I saw the gray of his eyes was now flecked with silver and black. "Thora," he said. But as he reached for me, I realized I couldn't feel his touch. My hand passed right through his, as if he were made of smoke. "Cillian," I whispered. He looked at his own hands, then at mine. We were standing in the same room, but we were in different worlds. He was the king of the silver, and I was the girl of the ash. The merge had separated us more effectively than the fire ever could. I'll find you, Cillian vowed, his voice sounding like it was coming from the other side of a waterfall. I don't care how many worlds I have to stitch together, I will find you. The palace around me began to fade. The great hall, the throne, the trees. It all turned into a gray, misty void. I was back in the ash. I looked around. I was standing in the ruins of the nursery 10 years ago. The fire was roaring around me. The smell of smoke was thick in my hair. And across the room, a young 7-year-old Cillian was reaching out for me. Thora, come on, we have to go. I looked at my hands. They were small, unscarred. I was back at the beginning. But as I looked into the flames, I saw a single, silver thread trailing from my heart, leading out of the fire and into the future. The mystery wasn't who I was. It was when I was. And the Fenris was still waiting. Chapter 9. The Ash and the Echo. The heat wasn't a memory anymore. It was a roar, a living, hungry beast that clawed at my lungs and turned the air into a soup of glowing embers. I looked down at my hands, small, soft, and unscarred. My nightgown was made of white lace, not the blood-stained rags of a survivor. I was 7 years old again, standing in the center of the cage nursery, and the world was ending for the first time. Thora. Come on, we have to go, Cillian. He was right there, a small boy with soot-streaked cheeks and eyes wide with a terror he didn't yet have the words for. He was reaching for me, his hand trembling as the heavy oak beams above us groaned under the weight of the inferno. I felt the silver thread in my chest pull tight. It was a cold, sharp needle of reality piercing through the stream of the past. I wasn't this child. I was the shadow. I was the queen of the ruins. But as I tried to move, my small legs felt heavy, tethered to the floor by the sheer gravity of the timeline. If I leave with him now, I thought, my mind racing with a decade of adult grief, the loop stays closed. The fire happens. The scars happen. The Fenris wins. Cillian, wait, I tried to shout, but my voice was the high, thin pipe of a girl who had never known silence. At the nursery door burst open, but it wasn't the guards. It was the old king. He looked younger, his face not yet hollowed out by madness, but his eyes. They were already full of that dark, calculative greed. He didn't look at his son. He looked at me. He looked at the way the fire seemed to curve around me, as if the flames themselves were afraid to touch the silver blood. The girl, the old king whispered, his voice barely audible over the crackle of the wood. Take the boy. Leave the girl. No, Cillian screamed, lunging for my hand. The old king's guards grabbed Cillian, hauling him backward into the smoke. I watched as the boy I loved was dragged away, his small fingers slipping from mine just like they had in the great hall, just like they had in the undersand. It was the same betrayal, echoing through time like a bell. And I stood alone as the roof began to buckle. This was the moment I was supposed to die. This was the moment the weaver wanted to reclaim. Stitch the world, my mother's voice whispered again, but she sounded farther away now, muffled by the roar of the fire. A needle must pass through the fabric twice to make the seam hold. I looked at the silver thread trailing from my heart. It led out of the nursery, through the wall of flames, and into the dark. I didn't run for the door. I ran for the fire. The heat was an absolute wall, but as I stepped into the center of the blaze, the silver in my blood flared. It didn't push the fire away. It absorbed it. I felt the heat of 10 years of anger, 10 years of scrubbing floors, and 10 years of wanting revenge manifest as a physical force. I wasn't burning. I was becoming the fire. And I walked through the nursery wall as if it were made of paper. I emerged not into the palace hallway, but into a space between heartbeats. The palace was a ghost, a translucent shell of stone. I could see the old king standing in the courtyard, watching the nursery wing collapse. I could see the young Cillian being forced into a carriage, his face pressed against the glass, screaming my name. And I could see the weaver. She was standing in the center of the courtyard, her obsidian form towering over the tiny mortal figures. She was holding the other end of my silver thread, winding it around her spindle with a slow, rhythmic motion. You cannot change what is written, Shadow, the weaver said, her voice vibrating through the stone. The fire is the knot. Without the fire, there is no silver Luna. Without the silver Luna, there is no I. If you save the girl, you erase the queen. Maybe the queen is tired of being a tragedy, I said, my voice sounding like the crackle of a forest fire. I looked at the carriage. I could see the moment Cillian's heart broke, the moment he accepted that I was gone. That break was the frequency the Fenris used to enter our world. If I could stop that break, I could kill the beast before it was even born. I ran across the courtyard, my feet leaving scorched prints on the grass. The weaver lashed out with a thread of shadow, but I caught it, the silver fire in my hands incinerating the darkness on contact. I am the thread, I roared, and I choose where I go. I reached the carriage just as the horses began to gallop. I didn't pull Cillian out. I reached through the glass and touched his small, tear-stained face. I didn't give him a memory. I gave him a promise. I am here, I whispered into his mind. Using the silver frequency to bypass the years, I am always here. Don't let the fire turn you into a statue. Stay a wolf, Cillian. Stay my wolf. The carriage didn't stop, but the boy's eyes changed. The terror didn't vanish, but a spark of something else, a stubborn, black-wooded defiance, took its place. He stopped screaming. He sat back, his small hand pressing against the glass where mine had been. The timeline shuddered. The weaver let out a shriek as the silver thread in her hand began to glow with a chaotic, prismatic light. The palace around us began to flicker, shifting between the pristine stone of the past and the blackened ruins of the future. You are unraveling the seam, the weaver cried. The paradox will consume us all. Then let it, I turned to the old king. But he was standing by the fountain, his face a mask of shock as he saw the ghost girl standing in his courtyard. I walked toward him, the silver fire trailing behind me like a wedding train. You wanted the power? I asked him, my voice echoing with the weight of the future. You wanted the silver eye? Here it is. I looked him straight in the eyes and released the full frequency of the Kingslayer. He didn't turn into a monster. He didn't shift. He simply saw the truth. He saw the decade of misery he was about to cause. He saw his own madness, his son's grief, and the death of his pack. The sheer weight of the future I shoved into his mind was too much for a mortal brain to hold. The old king collapsed to his knees, his eyes turning a dull, flat gray. He wasn't dead, but he was gone. The man who would have been a tyrant was now a shell, his mind a shattered mirror of a world that would never be. The fire in the nursery began to die down. It hadn't stopped, but it had changed. It hadn't consumed the girl. I looked back at the nursery window. The 7-year-old Thora was standing on the ledge. She wasn't burned. She wasn't scarred. She looked at me, the adult, fiery version of herself. And she didn't scream. She smiled. She stepped off the ledge, but she didn't fall. She turned into a silver bird, a phoenix of light, and flew toward the carriage, toward Cillian. I felt a sudden, sharp pain in my chest. The silver thread was snapping. The loop is broken, the weaver whispered, her obsidian form beginning to dissolve into a fine black dust. The shadow is gone. The light is born. But a world without shadows is a world without depth, Thora. You have saved the girl, but you have lost the queen. The courtyard, the fire, and the weaver all vanished into a white, blinding void. When I opened my eyes, I was back in the great hall, but it was different. The hall was full of people. They weren't statues. They weren't silver. They were wolves, and they were celebrating. The banners were blue and silver, and the smell of roasting venison and pine needles was thick in the air. I looked down at my hands. They were unscarred. I was wearing a gown of deep blue velvet, and a heavy weight sat on my head, a crown of real, solid silver. I looked at the throne. Cillian was sitting there. He was older, his face lined with the concerns of a king, but his eyes, they were warm, they were whole. He wasn't the brooding, broken man I'd met in the ruins. He was the man he was supposed to be. He saw me standing at the back of the hall and stood up, a wide, genuine smile breaking across his face. Thora, you're late for your own anniversary feast. The pack cheered, a loud, boisterous sound that was full of life. I walked toward him, my heart hammering. Every step felt strange, as if I were walking on a world I didn't quite belong to. I looked around for any sign of the fire, any sign of the ash. There was nothing. The cage pack was prosperous. The North and South were seated at the same tables, laughing and drinking. The war hadn't happened. The Fenris hadn't come. I reached the throne, and Cillian took my hands. His skin was warm. His scent, leather and rain, was the same, but it lacked the sharp tang of ozone and fear. Are you all right? He asked, his brow furrowing with concern. You look like you've seen a ghost. I'm fine, I whispered. My voice was smooth, clear. It didn't have the rasp of the ash. I looked at the hall, at the beautiful, perfect life I'd created by breaking the loop. I should have been happy. I should have been relieved. But as I looked into Cillian's eyes, I saw something was missing. He didn't know about the tower. He didn't know about the undersand. He didn't know about the girl who had scrubbed his floors and planned his salvation. To him, I was just the girl he'd grown up with, the girl he'd married, the girl who had never suffered. Our bond wasn't a victory over the dark, it was just a fact of life. I felt a sudden cold sensation in my palm. I looked down. Hidden in the folds of my velvet gown, a single silver ring was glowing. The signet of the Kingslayers. It shouldn't have been there. In this timeline, the ring was still in the southern vault, or perhaps it had never even been found. I touched it, and a flash of memory hit me, the smell of the smoke, the weight of the weaver's spindle, and the sound of Cillian's voice screaming my name in the ruins. The memory is the anchor, I realized. The pain is the stitch. I looked back at the hall, and for a second, the image flickered. I saw the ruins. I saw the silver desert. I saw the red moon. It was still there, lurking just beneath the surface of this perfect reality. The paradox hadn't saved us. It had just hidden the wound. Suddenly, the massive doors of the hall were thrown open. A messenger ran in, his face white with terror. He didn't bow. He fell to his knees. "My king, my queen, the border? The border is gone." Cillian stepped forward, his alpha presence flaring. "What do you mean? Gone? Speak." "It's the silver, sire. A wall of silver sand is moving across the northern mountains. Everything it touches turns to stone, and they're coming." "Who?" I asked, my heart freezing. "The girls with the scarred faces," the messenger gasped. "Thousands of them. They're calling themselves the Shadows, and they say they've come to reclaim their lives." I looked at Cillian. He looked at me, confusion and fear finally entering his perfect eyes. "Shadows?" he asked. "Thora? What is he talking about?" I didn't answer. I looked at the silver ring in my hand. The glow was spreading, crawling up my arm like a vine. I realized then what I'd done. By saving the girl, I hadn't erased the queen. I had split the world in two. The perfect Thora had the king and the throne. But the shadow Thora, the one with the scars and the pain, was still in the ruins, and she was angry. The great hall began to shake. A low-frequency hum, the same one I'd heard in the vault, began to vibrate the floorboards. "The hunt," I whispered, the word sounding like a death knell. "What?" Cillian asked, grabbing my shoulders. "Thora, you're shaking. What hunt?" I looked at the window. The beautiful blue sky was beginning to bruise. A red dot appeared in the center of the sun, growing larger by the second. The eye was back, and it was furious. "The hunt for the truth," I said, my voice finally finding the rasp of the ash. I reached out and touched Cillian's jaw, right where my scar used to be. "I have to go back, Cillian. I have to find the girl I left in the fire." "I don't understand," he cried, the silver flecks reappearing in his eyes. "You will," I promised. I took the silver ring and slammed it into the center of the great hall floor. The floor didn't break, it dissolved. But this time, I wasn't falling alone. The entire hall, the people, the food, the perfect Cillian, was being sucked into the obsidian void. As we fell, I saw the other Thora, the shadow, waiting for us at the bottom. She was standing on the silver dunes, her face a mask of jagged scars, her eyes a brilliant, lethal silver. She held a black wooded spear in her hand, and she was pointing it at the sky. "Welcome to the real world, princess," the shadow version of myself called out, her voice a roar that shook the dimensions. We hit the silver sand with a crash that felt like the end of time. The perfect Cillian looked up at the shadow Thora and let out a scream of total, shattering terror. He didn't recognize her. He didn't want her, but I did. I walked toward my scarred self, the silver ring glowing between us. "Is it time?" the shadow asked. "It's time," I said. We reached out and touched hands. The explosion of light was so intense, it felt like the sun had finally died. When it cleared, there was only one of us. I stood in the center of the silver desert, my face scarred, my gown a tattered mess of blue velvet and ash, my eyes a solid shimmering silver. I was the shadow and the queen. I was the fire and the frost. I looked at Cillian. Both versions of him had merged into a single man, lying in the sand. He looked up at me, and I saw it, the gray, the amber, and the silver all swirling together. He remembered everything. "Thora," he whispered, his voice a mix of love and absolute horror. "The Fenris isn't coming anymore, Cillian," I said, looking at the blood-red moon that now dominated the entire sky. "Why?" "Because," I said, as the sky began to rain silver fire, "I'm the one who's hungry now. I looked at the horizon, where the northern and southern armies were standing in shock. I didn't shift into a wolf. I didn't need to. I let out a howl that wasn't a sound. It was a command. And the entire world knelt. Chapter 10. The Last Moonrise. The silence following my command wasn't just quiet. It was a vacuum. 1,000 warriors, the elite of the north, the scavengers of the south, and my own Kaj kin, were pressed into the silver sand as if gravity itself had developed a grudge. They weren't just bowing. They were pinned by the sheer weight of the frequency I was broadcasting. It was the raw, unrefined sound of the first alpha, a vibration that resonated with the iron in their blood and the fear in their marrow. I stood in the center of the desert, my tattered blue velvet gown whipping around my legs. The silver ring fused to my skin like a brand. I felt infinite. I felt like I could reach up and pluck the red moon from the sky like a ripe fruit. But mostly, I felt the cold. A deep crystalline cold that started at my scars and moved inward, freezing the Thora, who used to worry about things like loyalty and love. Cillian was the only one who wasn't pinned. He was on his knees, yes, but he was looking up at me, his eyes a swirling nebula of gray, amber, and silver. He looked at me, and I saw his hand reach out, trembling. And before he pulled it back, "Thora," he whispered, his voice a ghost of the man I'd died for a dozen times. You're glowing." "I am the light they wanted, Cillian," I said, my voice sounding like the grinding of tectonic plates. "And I am the shadow they created. They wanted a queen? They've got one. Now they just have to survive me." I turned my gaze toward the horizon. The red moon, the eye, was no longer just watching. It was descending. It loomed so large now that the craters looked like vast dark canyons. And the red light was so intense, it turned the silver sand into a sea of clotted blood. The Fenris was gone, but the hunger that had birthed it was very much alive. From the front lines of the kneeling army, King Soren managed to lift his head. He looked broken, his white hair matted with blood and silver dust. His pride stripped away by the paradox of my return. "You've won, Shadow," Soren spat, his voice a ragged mess. "The north is broken, the south is scattered. Just end it. Unleash the moon and let the dark take us all. It's better than living in this nightmare you've stitched." "You don't get the easy way out, Soren," I said, walking toward him. Every step I took sent a ripple of silver fire through the sand. "You spent 10 years profiting from the ash I lived in. You don't get to die until you see what you've built." I raised my hand, and the silver ring pulsed. The sand beneath the northern and southern armies began to liquefy. It didn't swallow them. It rose up around them, forming 1,000 individual pillars of glass. Each warrior was encased in a transparent tomb, their faces frozen in expressions of absolute terror. "But Thora, stop!" Cillian scrambled to his feet, stumbling toward me. "This isn't justice. This is what the old king would have done. This is what the Weaver wanted." "The Weaver wanted a thread, Cillian. I'm the whole damn tapestry." I spun on him, the silver in my eyes flaring so bright he had to shield his face. "Look at them. They were ready to kill us for a throne made of bone. They were ready to follow a lie because it was easier than the truth. Why should I show them mercy?" "Because if you don't," Cillian shouted, stepping into the radius of my heat, his skin beginning to blister from the sheer intensity of my aura, "then the girl I loved really did die in that fire. The girl I loved was fierce. Yes, she was a survivor, but she wasn't a monster. She didn't hunt for the sake of the kill." He reached out and grabbed my shoulders, and the contact was like touching a sun. I saw the smoke rising from his palms, heard the hiss of his flesh burning, but he didn't let go. He looked me straight in the eyes, the gray in his pupils fighting back the silver. "I remember the floorboards, Thora," he whispered, his voice raw with pain. "I remember the coffee. I remember the way you looked at me when you thought I wasn't watching, not with power, but with hope. Don't let the moon take that. Don't let it win." I felt a crack in my resolve. The cold in my chest met the heat of his touch, and for a second, the frequency stuttered. The pillars of glass around the armies flickered, nearly shattering. But then, the sky screamed. The red moon had reached its zenith. The eye opened wide, and a beam of solid crimson light hit the center of the desert, at exactly where the cage palace used to stand. The impact didn't make a sound, but the shockwave threw us both to the ground. From the center of the crimson light, a figure emerged. It wasn't a girl, it wasn't a wolf. It was a man, tall and lean, wearing robes of shifting red smoke. His face was a perfect, terrifying mirror of Cillian's, but older, wiser, and entirely devoid of humanity. The father of the moon, the source of the silver. The cycle is complete, the entity said, his voice a melodic chime that bypassed the ears and spoke directly to the soul. The shadow has merged with the light. The debt is settled. Now, the harvest begins. He raised a hand, and the silver sand began to rise, not in dunes, but in a massive vertical wall that surrounded the entire territory. We were in a bowl of silver, and the father was the spoon. "'Cause who are you?" Cillian demanded, shifting into his black wolf form, his hackles raised as he stood over me. "I am the one who gave your ancestors the fire," the entity said, walking toward us with a slow, regal grace. "And I am the one who has come to take it back. The silver was a gift, a loan to see if your kind could handle the weight of the stars. You failed. You turned it into war. You turned it into ash. You turned it into a cage for your own kin." He looked at me, and I felt my soul being peeled open. "And you, Thora, you are the most interesting failure of all. You tried to stitch the world together with pain, but pain is a weak thread. It snaps." He reached for the ring on my finger. "I will take the silver back to the moon," he said, "and your world will return to what it was before the gift. No wolves, no shifts, no bonds. Just humans, alone in the dark, wondering why the forest feels so empty." "No," I whispered, clutching the ring. "The bond, it's not a gift. It's who we are. It is a burden you were never meant to carry," the father said. "Without it, there is no war. There is no north or south. There is no fire in the nursery. You can have your normal life, Thora. You can have a world where your face is never scarred, and your king is just a man who loves you." I looked at Cillian. I looked at the glass pillars where 1,000 warriors were waiting to be erased. I thought about a life without the shift. No running through the pines at midnight. No feeling the pulse of the pack. No smelling the rain before it hits the ground. No fated mate bond that could bridge the gap of time itself. It would be a quiet life, a safe life, a life of silence. "Cillian?" I asked, my voice trembling. Cillian shifted back to human, his eyes fixed on the father. He looked at me, and I saw the weight of the decision in his gaze. He loved me. He'd proven that across a dozen timelines. But did he love the wolf? Or did he love the woman? "I'd rather die a monster with you," Cillian said, his voice hard as iron, "than live a lie without our souls. The silver stays." The father of the moon smiled, a cold, beautiful expression. "Then you will die with it," and he snapped his fingers. The wall of silver sand collapsed inward. It wasn't a slow fall. It was a landslide of celestial weight. The crimson light from the moon intensified, turning the air into a furnace. "The stitch!" I screamed, grabbing Cillian's hand. "We have to use the stitch." "How?" "There are no ribbons left." "We are the ribbons." I grabbed the silver ring and twisted it. I didn't push the power out this time. I pulled it in. I pulled from Cillian's soul, from the earth beneath us, and from the red moon above. I became a black hole of frequency, a vacuum of silver and shadow. Cillian gripped my hand, his own alpha frequency merging with mine. We weren't two wolves anymore. We were a single, vibrating point of existence. "One for the throne," I roared. "One for the grave, one for the moon." The silver sand hit us. But we didn't break. We exploded. A pillar of pure, white light erupted from the center of the desert, piercing the red moon like a spear. The frequency was so high that the father of the moon let out a scream of genuine shock. His robes of red smoke were torn away, revealing a skeletal structure of pure light beneath. "You would destroy yourselves for a world of ash," the father shrieked. "It's our ash," I yelled. The white light expanded, consuming the desert, the glass pillars, the north, the south, and the father himself. It was a reset. Not a reset to the past, but a reset of the present. I felt my body being pulled apart. Atom by atom, I saw Cillian's face dissolving into light. I saw the 10 years of my life, the scrubbing, the scars, the revenge, all turning into a single, shimmering thread. And then I saw the truth. The silver line wasn't a gift. It wasn't a loan. It was a fragment of the moon that had fallen to earth and decided it wanted to be human. We weren't wolves with a gift. We were the moon itself, trying to understand what it meant to love. The white light reached its peak. The red moon shattered. The shockwave was so immense it didn't just end the world, it ended the story. When I opened my eyes, the silver sand was gone. The red moon was gone. I was lying on a forest floor. The air smelled of damp pine and wood smoke. It was cold. A normal winter cold that made my breath puff out in little white clouds. I pushed myself up, my muscles aching in a way that felt wonderfully, humanly real. I looked at my hands. They were covered in dirt and pine needles. The silver ring was gone. In its place was a simple, pale scar around my ring finger. I looked at my reflection in a nearby puddle. The scar on my jaw was still there. It was faint, but it was there. My eyes were gray, just gray. No amber, no silver. I felt a sudden, terrifying panic. The shift. Is it gone? I reached inside, looking for the wolf. I looked into the dark corners of my mind where the predator used to crouch. There was nothing, just silence. Cillian, I whispered, my voice shaking. Cillian! I scrambled to my feet, looking around the forest. This was the cage territory, but the palace was gone. In its place was a modest stone and timber manor, smoking peacefully in the morning mist. Cillian! From the manor, a man stepped out. He was wearing a simple wool tunic and leather trousers. He looked older, his hair flecked with a little more gray. His face weary but peaceful. He saw me and stopped. Thora? He walked toward me, his pace increasing until he was running. He reached me and pulled me into his arms, his scent, leather and rain, filling my senses. He was warm, he was real. You're here, he breathed, burying his face in my neck. But you're finally here. The wolf Cillian, I sobbed, clutching his back. It's gone, he took it. The father took it all. Cillian pulled back, looking at me with a strange, sad smile. I know, the whole pack, everyone, we're just us. I looked toward the forest. I saw a group of people emerging from the trees. Soren, Isolde, Xander, somehow alive. His face scarred, but his eyes clear. They were all human. They were all just people. The war was over because there was nothing left to fight for. No power, no hierarchy. Just survival. Was it worth it? I asked, looking at the empty sky. Yes, Cillian said, kissing my forehead. Because for the first time in 1,000 years, we're free. We stood there for a long time, watching the sun, a normal golden sun, rise over the mountains. It was the beginning of a new age. At the age of the shadow, without the silver. But as the sun hit the peaks of the mountains, I felt a sudden, sharp prick in my finger. I looked down at the scar on my ring finger. A tiny, microscopic speck of silver was glowing under the skin. And then I heard it. Not in my mind, but from the forest itself. A howl. It was distant, high, and full of a wild, primal joy. It wasn't a human voice. It wasn't a ghost. It was a wolf. A real, wild wolf. I looked at Cillian. He had heard it too. His eyes widened, and he looked toward the trees. The shift didn't go back to the moon, I whispered. The realization hitting me like a physical blow. It went back to the earth. The silver light under my skin began to pulse. Thump, 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 thump. The forest began to glow, not with the cold, artificial light of the desert, but with a deep, an emerald and silver radiance. The trees began to grow at a visible rate, their branches stretching toward the sky. And from the manor, my mother stepped out. She looked exactly as she had the day she died. Her eyes solid, shimmering silver. The harvest is over, Thora, she said, her voice echoing through the valley, but the planting has just begun. She pointed to the horizon. The red moon wasn't gone. It had just moved. It was now a tiny, brilliant red spark sitting right on the tip of the highest mountain. The seed is planted, my mother whispered, and the first one to reach it becomes the new god. Cillian and I looked at each other. The peace was over, the race had begun. And behind us the forest was starting to snarl.
Thank you for staying to the end. You are wonderful. Want more stories like this? Then don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. Till next time, stay fierce. Z.